Have you ever imagined yourself as a shadowy assassin, cloaked in darkness, moving silently through the twisting alleys of a medieval city, or the cold stone corridors of a towering castle? The image is intoxicating. Perhaps you picture a figure in a flowing black cloak, scaling a moonlit wall with effortless grace, or slipping through a torchlit hallway, dagger in hand, heart pounding with the thrill of the hunt. This romanticized vision, shaped by countless films, novels, and games, paints assassins as enigmatic heroes, masters of stealth and precision, living lives of adventure and intrigue. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, was a fractured, turbulent era. Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, fiefdoms, and city-states, each vying for power in a landscape where alliances shifted like sand. Kings clashed with nobles, nobles schemed against one another, and the church wielded spiritual and temporal authority, often entangled in the same power struggles. On one hand, it was an age of chivalry, of knights in shining armor and troubadours singing of courtly love. On the other, it was a time of brutal inequality, where the powerful hoarded wealth and the poor scratched out a living in the mud. Castles, symbols of strength and security, were also prisons for those who crossed their lords. Cities bustled with trade, but teemed with disease, crime, and mistrust. In this environment, assassins found their niche not as glamorous operatives, but as tools of the powerful, hired to do what armies or diplomacy could not. Their employers were often as ruthless as the deeds they commissioned, using assassins to eliminate rivals, silence dissent, or shift the balance of power without risking open conflict. In this chaotic world, assassination emerged as a tool of politics and revenge, a shadowy weapon for those who sought to eliminate rivals without open warfare. A single misstep could lead to capture, torture, or a gruesome public execution designed to deter others. But from a society steeped in superstition, where an assassin might be branded a sorcerer or demon, we'll examine the isolation that defined their lives, the betrayals that haunted them, and the fleeting moments of success that came at a terrible price. This journey is not just about the act of killing, but about the human stories behind it, the motivations, the sacrifices, and the relentless struggle to survive in a world that offered no mercy. So, let us step into the shadows of medieval Europe, where the assassin's path was as treacherous as it was lonely, and ask, what kind of person chose or was forced to walk this path, and what did it cost them? Even success brought little relief, as a completed mission often made the assassin a target, hunted by both their victims' allies and their own employers. Their lives were a constant dance on the edge of a blade, where every choice was a risk and every moment a test of cunning and endurance. To tell their story is to uncover a hidden layer of medieval history, one that challenges the romanticized narratives of knights and kings and reveals the cost of power in a world where life was cheap and loyalty was rare. Yet the men and women who carried out these deeds were not celebrated as heroes or feared as masterminds. They were disposable tools, used and discarded by their employers, nobles, clergy, or merchants who sought to keep their hands clean while reaping the benefits of a rival's death. But the reality of medieval assassins, those who operated in the shadows of Europe between the 5th and 15th centuries, was far less glamorous. Their lives were marked by hardship, not heroics, and their choices were driven by necessity rather than ambition. Their tools were not elegant, but crude stolen daggers, makeshift poisons, or whatever could be hidden beneath a tattered cloak. Their missions were not clean, but chaotic, fraught with the perils of fortified castles, vigilant guards, and paranoid targets. Their successes were fleeting, often followed by frantic escapes or betrayal by those they served. This is not a tale of noble sacrifices or cinematic triumphs. It is a story of desperation, solitude, and the heavy toll of living in the shadows. We'll walk through the dark alleys and towering castles of medieval Europe, where every corner hid danger and every choice carried a cost. Let's begin by asking, who were these figures, and what drove them to embrace such a perilous and thankless life? A peasant might take a contract to feed a starving family. A soldier might kill to settle a debt. A woman, overlooked by a patriarchal society, might use her perceived harmlessness to slip past guards with a hidden blade. Their stories reveal a darker side of the medieval era, one where survival often demanded sacrificing morality, safety, and even humanity. These were not the dashing rogues of fiction, but desperate souls navigating a brutal world where trust was a luxury and betrayal was a constant shadow. Theirs was a world not of glory, but of grim necessity, where every step was a gamble, every decision a brush with death, and every moment steeped in desperation, betrayal, and survival. Tonight, we'll strip away the myths and dive deep into the harsh, unforgiving lives of these forgotten figures, revealing a truth that is both fascinating and sobering. Before we begin this journey, I invite you to engage with this exploration. Please like, subscribe, and drop a comment below, letting me know the city you're tuning in from and the time on your clock. Your support breathes life into these historical tales, and I'm grateful you're here. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's embark on this somber yet captivating journey into the world of medieval assassins. The allure of the assassin's life is a modern creation, crafted by Hollywood's lens and the vivid imaginations of storytellers. In films, assassins are often portrayed as sleek, highly trained operatives. Think of the acrobatic killers in Assassin's Creed or The Brooding, calculating figures in historical dramas. They move with an almost supernatural grace, trained in secret mountaintop temples or hidden guilds, wielding exotic weapons and guided by ancient codes of honor. But the medieval reality was starkly different. Assassins were not the polished heroes of legend. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, driven not by a thirst for glory, but by the crushing weight of poverty, desperation, or circumstance. They were not born assassins, but became them when life left them no other path. Their stories are not etched in the grand chronicles of kings and queens, but linger in the margins of history-whispered rumors in tavern corners. Fleeting mentions in dusty court records or grim tales, passed down through generations, often distorted by fear and superstition. To understand the world of medieval assassins, we must step back into a time when life itself was a battle for survival. These assassins were often society's outcasts, peasants who had lost their land to a greedy lord, soldiers disgraced or discharged after a lost battle, thieves facing execution, or wanderers with nowhere left to turn. As we embark on this exploration, we'll uncover the gritty details of who these assassins were, how they operated, and the harsh realities they faced. The medieval world they inhabited was a place of stark contrasts. Yet the assassin's role came with no guarantees. Payment was uncertain, betrayal was common, and survival was never assured. As we delve deeper, we'll explore the tools they used, the disguises they wore, and the fears they faced, not just from guards or enemies. When we think of assassins, Hollywood's vivid imagery often takes hold. Enigmatic loners draped in dark cloaks, trained in secret. Mountaintop temples or shadowy guilds moving through the night with the grace of a panther and the precision of a master swordsman. At the apex sat kings, nobles, and high-ranking clergy, wielding power over land, wealth, and justice. With no means to feed their family, they faced starvation or indentured servitude. Or consider a soldier discharged from service after a crippling injury or accused of cowardice in battle, left with no prospects and no honor. A thief, caught once too often, might face execution or mutilation, losing a hand or an ear, unless they could offer something of value to a powerful patron. For these individuals, assassination was not a glamorous choice, but a grim necessity, a way to claw their way back from the brink. They were not driven by dreams of glory or the thrill of danger. They were people staring down the abyss of starvation, imprisonment, or worse, willing to risk everything for a chance at a better life, or at least a few more days of survival. Below them were knights, merchants, and skilled artisans, who enjoyed relative stability, but were still beholden to those above. At the base of this pyramid were the peasants, the vast majority of the population, bound to the land and a life of grueling toil. For most, social mobility was a distant dream, a fantasy crushed by the weight of feudal obligations and economic hardship. Falling from grace, whether through debt, crime, or sheer misfortune, could push someone to the margins of this society, where survival often meant abandoning morality or legality. It was from these margins that many assassins emerged, individuals who had been cast out or broken by a system that offered little mercy and fewer second chances. These cinematic portrayals paint assassins as almost mythical figures, elite warriors bound by ancient codes, wielding exotic weapons and operating with an air of untouchable mystique. But the reality of medieval assassins, those who operated in the shadows of Europe between the 5th and 15th centuries, was far less glamorous and far more human. They were not the polished heroes of legend or the romanticized anti-heroes of modern fiction. Instead, they were society's outcasts, desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, former thieves, or individuals who had fallen through the cracks of a rigid and unforgiving feudal system. Assassination was not a chosen career path, not a calling pursued with passion or pride, but a desperate last resort for those whose lives had unraveled, leaving them with few, if any, options for survival. In the medieval world, society was structured like a pyramid, with a rigid hierarchy that dictated every aspect of life. Imagine a peasant who had lost their small plot of land to a greedy lord, perhaps through unfair taxes or outright seizure. The motivations that led someone to become an assassin were as varied as the individuals themselves, shaped by the unique circumstances of their lives and the harsh realities of their world. Some were coerced into the role, blackmailed by powerful figures who held leverage over them, perhaps a family member's safety, a debt that could never be repaid, or a secret that could ruin them. A lord might threaten a peasant's children, promising harm unless a rival was eliminated, while men dominated the role due to the physical demands of infiltration or combat. And the patriarchal norms of the time, women occasionally took on such tasks, leveraging their perceived harmlessness to gain access to targets. A feudal system bound peasants to the land, while lords and knights held sway over life and death. Thomas's lord seizes his family's land after a poor harvest, leaving him and his siblings to fend for themselves. Take the example of a woman like Agnes, a servant in a noble's household in 14th century Italy. Historical records rarely give us names or detailed accounts, but they hint at the broader picture. In 11th century Germany, a chronicle mentions a lowly woman caught attempting to poison a bishop, her motives unclear, but likely tied to coercion or desperation. They operated in a world where trust was a luxury they could not afford. Allies were rare, and even those who hired them were potential enemies, ready to betray them to cover their tracks. An assassin's life was one of constant vigilance, where every stranger could be a threat and every job could be a trap. This paranoia was not unfounded. Historical accounts often mention assassins being hunted down by their own employers, their usefulness outweighed by the need for secrecy. In 13th century England, a man described as a vagabond was executed for attempting to kill a local lord. His name lost to history, but his fate a stark reminder of the risks assassins faced. They learned to move quietly, to blend into crowds, to read the intentions of others, all skills born of necessity rather than formal instruction. A thief might teach them to pick a lock, but only in exchange for a cut of the payment. A mercenary might show them how to use a dagger, but only if it served their own ends. These fleeting lessons were often all an assassin had to rely on, making every mission a gamble where the stakes were life and death. These fleeting references underscore the anonymity and disposability of assassins, who were rarely seen as individuals, but as tools to be used and discarded. but products of their time, a time when survival demanded hard choices, and the powerful used the powerless to do their bidding. They were ordinary people driven to extraordinary acts, not by choice, but by circumstance. Their stories, though rarely recorded, offer a window into the darker corners of medieval society, where desperation and danger walked hand in hand. As we move forward in this exploration, we'll delve into the missions they undertook, the tools they used, and the brutal realities they faced, painting a fuller picture of a life that was as tragic as it was perilous. After her husband's death leaves her destitute, she is approached by a rival noble who promises protection for her children if she poisons her master Esmoine. Agnes, with access to the kitchen and the trust of the household, is in a unique position to act. Her gender makes her invisible to the guards, who dismiss her as harmless. Yet, like Thomas, she acts out of necessity, not ambition, knowing that success might bring temporary relief, but failure could mean death for her and her family. With no prospects and a sister to feed, Thomas is approached by a merchant seeking to eliminate a rival. The promise of a small purse of silver enough to buy food for months is too tempting to refuse. Thomas has no training, only a rusty knife and a lifetime of hardship to guide him. His story, though fictional, mirrors the reality of many assassins, ordinary people driven to desperate acts by a world that offered no other way out. Cities, though growing in importance, were often cesspools of poverty and crime, where the desperate mingled with the dangerous. In this environment, assassination became a tool of the powerful, a way to eliminate rivals without the expense of war or the risk of public scandal. Yet the assassins themselves were rarely part of this power structure. While most were drawn from the lower classes, some came from slightly higher stations petty knights who had lost favor, disgraced clerics, or even merchants fallen on hard times. These individuals brought different skills to their work. A knight might know how to navigate a castle's layout. A cleric might use their literacy to forge documents or gain access to a target, and a merchant might exploit trade networks to move undetected. Yet, regardless of their origins, they shared a common fate. Once they took on the role of assassin, they were marked, their lives defined by danger and isolation. They were pawns, used and discarded by those who hired them, their lives valued only for the brief moment they served a purpose. A washerwoman carrying a basket of linens could slip into a castle unnoticed, her presence unquestioned by guards, who saw her as no threat. A servant girl, blending into the hustle of a noble's household, might carry a vial of poison or a small blade hidden in her apron. These women, like their male counterparts, were often driven by desperation, perhaps a widow with no means to support herself, or a woman fleeing an abusive master. Their involvement in assassination was rare, but not unheard of, and their ability to exploit societal assumptions about gender made them uniquely effective in certain scenarios. Regardless of gender, all assassins were united by a common thread: the willingness to cross moral and social lines in a world that offered them little choice. Others turned to assassination as a form of personal vengeance, targeting a cruel lord, a corrupt cleric, or a rival who had wronged them in ways that could not be addressed through legal or social means. They were not trained in secret schools, as romanticized tales might suggest, nor were they guided by ancient codes or mystical traditions. There were no hidden guilds passing down the secrets of stealth or poison. Such organizations, if they existed at all, were more likely loose networks of criminals or mercenaries than formalized institutions. Instead, assassins were ordinary people pushed to extraordinary lengths by a world that left them no other path. A peasant might learn to wield a stolen dagger out of necessity, not training. A disgraced soldier might rely on battlefield instincts to navigate a castle's defenses, not a mentor's guidance. Their skills were born of survival, honed through trial and error, and often paid for in blood, either their own or that of their targets. In rare cases, assassins were driven by ideology, believing their actions served a higher purpose perhaps, targeting a tyrant whose rule oppressed the people, or a bishop whose corruption defiled the church. But for the vast majority, the driving force was survival, pure and simple. In a world where mercy was scarce and justice was a privilege of the powerful, assassination offered a slim chance to escape destitution or death, even if it meant crossing moral and social boundaries that could never be uncrossed. Court records from the medieval period, though sparse and often incomplete, offer glimpses into the lives of these shadowy figures. They are rarely named, often described simply as vagrants, men of no name, or wanderers, terms that underscore their low status and anonymity. In a 13th century English chronicle, a man hired to kill a local noble is described as a wretch of no account, driven by want, highlighting the desperation that defined many assassins. These records, though brief, paint a picture of individuals who existed on the fringes of society, invisible to the chroniclers of great deeds, but essential to the machinations of power. Their anonymity was both a shield and a curse, protecting them from immediate recognition, but ensuring they would be forgotten, their lives erased from history as quickly as their deeds were done. The diversity of medieval assassins is another aspect that defies the Hollywood stereotype. This lack of choice is central to understanding who medieval assassins were. The lives of these assassins were shaped by the broader context of medieval society, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and the majority lived under constant threat of famine, disease, or violence. Consider the case of a hypothetical assassin. Let's call him Thomas, a former serf in 12th century France. Women, too, played their part in this shadowy world. These stories, though imagined, are grounded in the realities of the time. The diversity of assassins also extended to their backgrounds. This isolation was perhaps the most defining trait of a medieval assassin's life. The skills of an assassin were not those of a trained warrior, but of a survivor. In the end, medieval assassins were not the glamorous figures of modern fiction. The life of a medieval assassin was not one of cinematic glamour, with sleek infiltrations and daring escapes, but a grueling, high-stakes struggle where every mission was a gamble against overwhelming odds. The target, whether a noble in a fortified castle or a bishop in a heavily guarded cathedral, was rarely accessible. Imagine crouching in a cramped barrel, the air thick with the stench of rotting wood and mold, your body aching from hours of immobility. Or picture lying in a haystack, plagued by fleas and the constant itch of straw, unable to move for fear of rustling the pile and alerting a passing servant. Some assassins hid in sewers or ditches, enduring filth and cold, their bodies weakened by hunger and exposure. One such story comes from 12th century England, where a man named Hugh, described in a chronicle as a landless wanderer, was hired to assassinate a local bishop who had incurred the wrath of a rival noble. Guards were often veterans of local wars, trained to spot intruders and respond with lethal force. Servants, though lower in status, were no less vigilant, often loyal to their masters, and quick to report anything suspicious. Assassins operated in a state of constant stress, their minds sharpened by necessity, but worn down by fear and isolation. Employers dangled the prospect of wealth to lure desperate individuals into their service, but the reality was often far different. A noble might promise a plot of land, only to renege once the deed was done, citing some technicality or claiming the assassin had failed to meet expectations. In 13th century France, a man known only as the Stranger was hired to kill a rival noble during a feast. Assassins, drawn from the lowest rungs of society, were seen as expendable, their deaths a minor inconvenience compared to the loss of a noble or cleric. This disparity was reflected in the punishments meted out to captured assassins. Public executions were designed to be as gruesome as possible, often involving torture, dismemberment, or burning at the stake. These spectacles served a dual purpose: to punish the individual and to deter others from following in their footsteps. Yet, despite the risks, desperation drove countless individuals to take up the assassin's trade, lured by the faint hope of a better life in a world that offered little else. He disguised himself as a servant, carrying a small blade hidden in his sleeve, and spent days blending into the household. Each mission was a high-stakes gamble, where the odds were stacked against success and the consequences of failure were catastrophic. From the physical toll of hiding in filthy, cramped spaces to the psychological strain of living in constant fear, assassins faced challenges that tested every aspect of their being. Their employers, far from being allies, were often their greatest threat, ready to betray them to protect their own interests. The assassin's life was a relentless cycle of danger, with no reprieve and no guarantee of reward. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve deeper into the skills they developed, the tools they used, and the betrayals they faced, painting a fuller picture of a life that was as perilous as it was tragic. His attempt was foiled when a guest noticed his nervous demeanor, leading to his capture and execution. Such stories, though brief, highlight the razor-thin margin between success and failure. The assassin's life was one of constant danger, where the promise of reward was outweighed by the likelihood of betrayal, capture, or death. A merchant might offer gold, only to send hired thugs to reclaim it, or to ensure the assassin's silence through more permanent means. The uncertainty of payment added another layer of risk, as assassins had to weigh the likelihood of betrayal against their immediate needs. For a starving peasant or a fugitive thief, even the slimmest chance of reward was worth the gamble, but the cost was often their life. They had no allies to rely on, no confidants to share their burdens. Assassins had to think on their feet, adjusting to unexpected obstacles. A guard posted at an unexpected gate, a target who changed their routine, or a sudden storm that made stealth impossible. They relied on rudimentary tools and improvised strategies, as there were no specialized weapons or training academies to equip them. A stolen dagger, a rope, or a vial of crude poison was often all they had, and even these carried risks. Carrying a weapon could mark them as suspicious, while poison was notoriously unreliable. Every decision was a calculated risk, and every mission a test of endurance, ingenuity, and sheer luck. Even other criminals, thieves, mercenaries, or bandits kept their distance, viewing assassins as liabilities too dangerous to associate with. The weight of their actions, combined with the knowledge that betrayal or capture was always a possibility, created a life of unrelenting tension. For many, the promise of payment was the only thing keeping them going, a faint hope of escaping their circumstances, even if that hope was often illusory. Even the physical environment conspired against the assassin. Narrow corridors, creaky wooden floors, and barking dogs could betray their presence. Weather was another enemy. Rain turned dirt paths to mud, slowing escape, while cold nights made hiding outdoors a test of endurance. The assassin's world was one where every element, from human to natural, seemed aligned against their success. Hugh's mission required him to infiltrate the bishop's manor, a heavily guarded compound surrounded by a moat and patrolled by armed retainers. A failed attempt turned the assassin into a hunted criminal, pursued by the target's allies, local authorities, and often their own employers. Success brought its own dangers, as the act of killing a prominent figure stirred immediate chaos. Guards would be roused, gates locked, and search parties dispatched. The assassin had to flee immediately, often through unfamiliar terrain, with no safe haven to return to. Even a successful mission created new enemies. Those loyal to the target might seek vengeance, while the employer might betray the assassin to eliminate any risk of exposure. The life of an assassin was a relentless cycle of danger, from the planning and execution of a mission to the perilous aftermath, with little room for rest or safety. For 3 days, he hid in a stable, buried under piles of straw, enduring hunger and the stench of manure while waiting for an opportunity to strike. His plan was meticulous, relying on a stolen servant's tunic to blend in, But his luck ran out when a stable boy noticed movement in the straw. Hugh was captured, subjected to brutal interrogation, and ultimately executed, his body displayed on a gibbet as a warning to others. Such stories, though sparse, were not uncommon, underscoring the brutal reality that assassins faced not just their targets, but an entire system designed to protect the powerful and punish the weak. These were not the swift, clean operations of modern fiction, but prolonged tests of endurance, where survival demanded as much resilience as cunning. The physical strain was compounded by the ever-present fear of discovery. A creaking floorboard, a curious glance, or a stray animal could unravel days of careful planning. Castles were designed as impregnable fortresses, with high stone walls, deep moats, and drawbridges that could be raised at a moment's notice. The act of killing, even for those hardened by desperation, was not a trivial matter. Employers, typically nobles, clergy, or wealthy merchants, were rarely trustworthy. Eager to cover their tracks, they might refuse payment, claiming the job was incomplete or unsatisfactory. Worse, they might send their own men to eliminate the assassin, ensuring no loose ends remained. This betrayal was a constant threat, as the very act of hiring an assassin implicated the employer in a crime that could lead to their own downfall. Even if payment was secured, a purse of silver, a promise of land, or safe passage to another region using it was a challenge. An assassin suddenly flush with wealth in a small, tight-knit community drew suspicion. A peasant flashing coins could be marked as a thief or worse, attracting the attention of local authorities or opportunistic criminals. Spending the reward required careful planning, perhaps bribing. A merchant for silence or fleeing to a distant town where questions were less likely to be asked. Many were ordinary people, peasants, soldiers, or outcasts who had been pushed into this life by circumstance, not choice. The moral conflict of taking a life, even one deemed corrupt or tyrannical, gnawed at them, especially in a deeply religious age where murder was a sin that could damn the soul. The constant fear of capture added to this burden, as every shadow could hide a guard, every whisper of betrayal. Assassins lived in a state of heightened paranoia, knowing that a single mistake, a dropped weapon, a moment's hesitation could lead to capture, torture, and a gruesome public execution designed to deter others. Manor houses, though less imposing, were no less secure, often surrounded by palisades and patrolled by armed retainers. To even approach their target, an assassin had to navigate a gauntlet of physical barriers, scaling walls under cover of darkness, crossing moats in freezing water, or slipping through gates left ajar by a bribed servant. Each step was fraught with peril, as a single misstep could alert guards or trigger alarms, such as the barking of dogs or the clanging of a bell. Unlike the Hollywood trope of assassins targeting random victims in dramatic, choreographed strikes, medieval assassins were tasked with eliminating the most powerful and well-protected figures of their time barons, bishops, or even royalty. These were not ordinary folk, but individuals surrounded by layers of security, guards trained for combat, wealth that funded fortifications, and loyal retainers who watched for any sign of danger. The missions assigned to assassins were not glamorous heists, but brutal, exhausting endeavors, with a promise of reward, a hefty sum of coins. A plot of land or a chance at a new life was overshadowed by the constant threat of failure, betrayal, and death. The reality of these missions was far removed from the romanticized ideal, revealing a world of physical hardship, psychological torment, and relentless danger that defined the assassin's existence. A typical mission began long before the act itself, requiring meticulous planning and reconnaissance in an era where information was scarce and unreliable. The physical toll of these missions was immense. Assassins often spent days or even weeks preparing, hiding in the most inhospitable conditions to avoid detection. The psychological burden was equally crushing. Assassins carried the weight of their actions, knowing that each mission could be their last. The dangers did not end with the act itself. Completing a mission often marked the beginning of a new set of perils. Historical accounts, though rare and often incomplete, paint a vivid picture of these risks. The system itself was a formidable adversary. Medieval society was structured to safeguard the elite, with castles and manors built as much for defense as for prestige. The aftermath of a mission, whether successful or not, was a period of intense vulnerability. The psychological toll of this cycle cannot be overstated. The promise of reward was a powerful motivator, but it was rarely as simple as collecting a purse of coins. The physical demands of a mission were matched by the need for cunning and adaptability. Historical examples, though few, illustrate the precarious nature of these missions. The broader context of medieval society amplified these risks. The powerful were not just protected by physical barriers, but by a social order that valued their lives above all others. In the end, the dangerous missions and harsh realities of medieval assassins reveal a life defined not by glory, but by survival. The romanticized image of a medieval assassin honing their craft in a secret dojo, guided by a wise mentor under flickering candlelight, is a captivating but wholly fictional notion. Popular media films, novels, and games often portray assassins as disciplined operatives, trained in hidden temples or shadowy guilds, mastering intricate techniques passed down through generations. They had no access to formal training or mentors who could guide them through the complexities of their dangerous work. A failed attempt might teach them to move more quietly, to avoid creaking floorboards or rustling bushes, but it could also lead to discovery by vigilant guards. In a deeply religious era, where murder was considered a grave sin with eternal consequences, assassins had to grapple with the psychological burden of their actions alone. Without formal training, assassins had to adapt each situation on the fly, using whatever resources were at hand. In 13th century Italy, a man described as a vagrant was caught attempting to infiltrate a noble's household. Thieves, operating in the underbelly of medieval cities, might share tricks for moving unseen or picking locks, but their loyalty was fleeting, and they viewed assassins as dangerous liabilities. They might study the layout of a castle by observing it from a distance, noting the timing of guard changes or the habits of servants. Assassins operated in a world where trust was a luxury they could not afford. Even those who shared knowledge with them, thieves, mercenaries, or herbalists, were potential threats, ready to betray them for a reward or to save their own skins. Castles were designed to thwart intruders, with narrow corridors, locked gates, and vigilant guards. In a society where community and kinship were vital for survival, assassins were cut off from both. They could not confide in friends or family, as doing so risked betrayal or exposure. Even other criminals, who might share their world of lawlessness, kept their distance, wary of associating with someone whose actions could bring down the wrath of the powerful. This isolation forced assassins to internalize their fears and guilt, carrying the burden of their choices in silence. The knowledge that they were disposable, used by their employers and discarded when no longer needed, only deepened their sense of alienation. A poorly planned approach could lead to disaster. A door that wouldn't open, a guard who lingered too long, or a dog that sensed their presence. Every skill was learned through survival, every lesson paid for in risk or sacrifice. There were no mentors to guide them, no schools to prepare them, only the relentless pressure of necessity driving them forward. Their story is one of resilience and desperation, of ordinary people forced to navigate extraordinary dangers with nothing but their wits and their will to survive. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the tools they used, the betrayals they faced, and the harsh realities of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as perilous as it was unforgiving. Assassins had to learn to anticipate these challenges through experience, often paying a heavy price for their ignorance. A failed mission might teach them to check for hidden exits, or to time their approach with the changing of the guard. But that knowledge came too late for many who found themselves facing a noose or a torturer's tools. This lack of camaraderie meant that assassins faced their fears and doubts alone, with no one to offer guidance or support. The moral weight of their actions, combined with the constant threat of capture, created a life of relentless tension, where every moment was a battle against both external dangers and internal demons. They learned to blend into crowds, adopting the posture and speech of a peasant or pilgrim to avoid suspicion. Without access to specialized equipment, assassins relied on whatever was at hand: a stolen dagger, a piece of rope, or a stone that could be used as a bludgeon. They learned to exploit their environment, using shadows to conceal their movements, or turning everyday objects into tools of their trade. A cloak could muffle a struggle, a broken bottle could serve as a weapon, and a handful of dirt could blind a guard long enough to escape. This resourcefulness was born of necessity, as assassins had no one to provide them with better tools or teach them more effective techniques. They honed their ability to think quickly, adapting to unexpected obstacles, a locked door, a sudden rainstorm, or a target who changed their routine. These skills were not taught in a classroom, but in the field, where every mistake was a lesson and every success a fleeting reprieve. Mercenaries, hardened by years of warfare, might demonstrate how to kill quickly with a blade, but their lessons were often transactional, offered only for a price or under coercion. Apothecaries or herbalists, who knew the properties of plants and minerals, were rare sources of knowledge about poisons, but they were wary of sharing such secrets, knowing the consequences of being linked to a murder. These interactions were not mentorships, but brief exchanges, driven by mutual need or opportunism, and they left assassins with incomplete, often unreliable knowledge. His only preparation, according to court records, was watching the guards' routines for days while hiding in a nearby ditch, learning their patterns through observation rather than instruction. His attempt failed when he tripped on a loose stone, alerting a servant, but the incident reveals how assassins relied on their own wits to navigate complex challenges. Another account from 12th century England mentions a woman who poisoned a bishop's wine, having learned the properties of a toxic herb from a local healer. Her knowledge was rudimentary, based on a single conversation, and the poison only sickened the bishop, leading to her capture. These stories highlight the ad hoc nature of an assassin's skills, pieced together from fleeting opportunities and honed through painful experience. A poorly planned infiltration could lead to discovery. A misstep in a dark corridor, a shadow cast by a flickering torch, or a guard's unexpected patrol could unravel days of preparation. A misjudged strike might wound rather than kill, alerting the target's protectors and turning a stealthy operation into a chaotic scramble for survival. The lack of reliable tools or techniques compounded these risks. Assassins often worked with stolen or makeshift weapons, a rusty dagger, a length of rope, or a vial of crude poison concocted from local herbs. These tools were unpredictable, and their use required a level of ingenuity born of desperation. A poison that failed to kill could sicken the assassin themselves, while a dull blade might require multiple strikes, increasing the risk of detection. There were no mentors to offer wisdom on navigating guilt, fear, or the existential dread of living a life marked by violence and betrayal. Many assassins were likely haunted by their deeds, whether it was the face of a target pleading for mercy or the knowledge that their actions had condemned them in the eyes of God and society. The isolation of their trade meant they had no one to confide in, no one to share the burden of their choices. This solitude amplified the psychological strain, turning every mission into a test of mental endurance as much as physical skill. A botched strike might reveal the importance of aiming for vital areas, but a wounded target could raise an alarm, turning a quiet infiltration into a desperate flight. Every mission was a gamble, where the stakes were life and death, and the learning curve was mercilessly steep. An assassin might learn to hide a blade under a cloak after a near miss with a suspicious servant, but that knowledge came at the cost of heightened paranoia and the constant fear of being caught. The absence of formal training meant that every skill was hard-won, often paid for in moments of terror or pain, and there was no one to guide them through the process or offer reassurance when the weight of their actions became unbearable. The skills they developed were born of necessity, pieced together from whatever scraps of knowledge they could glean from their environment or fleeting encounters with others on society's fringes. A thief might teach an assassin how to pick a lock, but only in exchange for a share of the spoils or under duress, and such lessons were often cursory, leaving gaps that could prove fatal. A mercenary might demonstrate how to wield a dagger effectively, but only if it served their own interests, and even then, the instruction was likely brief and incomplete. An apothecary or herbalist might share knowledge of plants that could sicken or kill, but such secrets were guarded jealously, and the information was often unreliable, based on folklore rather than science. These fleeting interactions were the closest an assassin came to training, but they were far from the structured mentorship of fictional tales. In reality, the medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to 15th centuries, offered no such luxuries to those who took up the grim trade of assassination. There were no schools, no manuals, no candlelit training grounds where aspiring killers learned the art of stealth or combat. Instead, medieval assassins were forged in the crucible of survival, their skills hard-earned through trial and error, often at a devastating personal cost. Every lesson came from experienced narrow escapes, botched attempts, and the rare success that kept them alive for another day. For these individuals, the path to becoming an assassin was not a structured apprenticeship, but a brutal, unforgiving school where failure could mean capture, torture, or death. Unlike the elite warriors of modern fiction, medieval assassins were typically ordinary people, peasants, disgraced soldiers, or outcasts, driven to their trade by desperation rather than ambition. Most of an assassin's knowledge was self-taught, acquired through the harsh lessons of survival. This lack of mentorship extended beyond practical skills to the emotional and moral toll of their work. The reliance on instinct, improvisation, and luck made every mission a high-stakes gamble. Historical records, though sparse, offer glimpses into the improvisational nature of an assassin's training. The individuals who taught assassins what little they knew were often as marginalized as the assassins themselves. The lack of formal training also meant that assassins had to develop a keen sense of their environment, learning to read subtle cues that could mean the difference between success and failure. The psychological isolation of this self-taught existence cannot be overstated. The improvisational nature of their skills extended to their methods of operation. The absence of formal training also meant that assassins were often unprepared for the complexities of their target's defenses. The emotional toll of this life was compounded by the lack of any support system. In the end, the training of a medieval assassin was not a structured process, but a brutal, self-directed journey through a world that offered no mercy. For medieval assassins, the promise of payment was a flickering beacon of hope in a life otherwise defined by desperation and danger. The prospect of a purse heavy with silver coins, a plot of fertile land, or even safe passage to a new life was often the only thing compelling enough to drive an individual to undertake the perilous task of assassination. Employers, typically nobles, wealthy merchants, or high-ranking clergy, knew how to exploit this desperation, dangling the allure of wealth to lure society's outcasts into their service. Yet, the reality of securing that payment was far from straightforward. In the shadowy world of medieval intrigue, betrayal was not just a possibility, but a near inevitability. Once the deed was done, employers frequently reneged on their promises, refusing payment on flimsy pretexts or worse, ordering the assassin's death to ensure their silence. For these hired killers, every mission was a gamble where the stakes were not just financial, but existential, and trust was a luxury they could ill afford. The dynamics of this deception began with the initial agreement. Employers, often powerful, Figures with much to lose were skilled manipulators, preying on the vulnerabilities of those they hired. A peasant facing starvation, a disgraced soldier with no prospects, or a fugitive thief on the run from justice were easy targets for promises of wealth or redemption. A noble might offer a sack of gold to eliminate a rival threatening their claim to land, while a merchant could promise a share of trade profits to remove a competitor. Clergy, too, were not above such schemes, sometimes hiring assassins to silence critics of the church or rival clerics vying for power. These employers painted vivid pictures of reward, a new life free from poverty, a chance to reclaim lost status, or simply enough coin to survive another season. For those on society's margins, such promises were intoxicating, even if laced with doubt. However, the moment the assassination was complete, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The assassin, now living witness to a heinous crime, became a liability. Employers, driven by self-preservation, often betrayed their hired hands with ruthless efficiency. Refusing payment was a common tactic. Some claimed the job was incomplete, perhaps because the target's death was not discreet enough or caused too much uproar. Others might argue the assassin had failed to follow precise instructions, using technicalities to justify withholding the promised reward. In more sinister cases, employers took drastic measures to eliminate the risk entirely, dispatching their own men to hunt down and kill the assassin. This betrayal transformed the hired killer into a loose end, a threat to be silenced before they could expose their employer's involvement. This betrayal was not merely a financial blow, but a life-threatening one. An unpaid assassin was often a hunted one, pursued not only by their former employer's guards, but also by local authorities, who might have been tipped off anonymously to deflect suspicion from the true mastermind. The assassin's low status made them an easy scapegoat. Nobody questioned the guilt of a vagrant or outcast caught near a crime scene. Escape required cunning and speed, as the assassin had to navigate unfamiliar terrain, evade pursuers, and find a way to survive without the resources they had been promised. For those who managed to secure payment, new challenges arose. A sudden influx of wealth in a small, tightly knit medieval community was a red flag. A peasant flashing silver coins in a village market, or a wanderer purchasing goods beyond there. Apparent means could draw the attention of suspicious neighbors, greedy thieves, or inquisitive sheriffs. Spending the reward required careful planning, perhaps bribing a merchant for silence, trading coins for goods in secret, or fleeing to a distant town where their past was unknown and questions were less likely to be asked. Historical records, though sparse, offer chilling examples of such betrayals. In 13th century France, a hired killer named Guillaume was promised a plot of land for assassinating a rival noble who threatened his employer's claim to a contested estate. Guillaume, a former serf who had fled after his lord seized his family's land, saw the offer as a chance to reclaim a semblance of stability. He spent days planning the mission, infiltrating the noble's manor by posing as a laborer and striking when the target was alone. The assassination was successful, but when Guillaume returned to claim his reward, he was ambushed by his employer's guards in a secluded forest. Barely escaping with his life, he fled the region, his dreams of a new life shattered. Such stories, though rare in surviving records, were likely common, as they reflect the precarious nature of an assassin's existence. Another account from 12th century England mentions a nameless man hired to kill a bishop. After completing the task, he was betrayed by his employer, a rival cleric who alerted the local authorities. The assassin was captured and executed, his employer emerging unscathed, a stark reminder of the power imbalance between the powerful and their disposable tools. The constant threat of betrayal shaped every aspect of an assassin's approach to their work. Trust was a dangerous illusion, and assassins had to assume their employers were as much a threat as their targets. This paranoia influenced how they negotiated their contracts, often demanding partial payment up front or arranging secret meeting points to collect their reward. Some insisted on intermediaries, trusted or semi-trusted go-betweens who could deliver payment without direct contact, reducing the risk of an ambush. Yet even these precautions were no guarantee of safety. Intermediaries could be bribed or coerced, and upfront payments were often meager, barely enough to sustain the assassin through the mission's planning stages. The promise of a larger reward kept them tethered to the job, even as their instincts warned of the dangers ahead. The act of collecting payment was itself a logistical challenge. In medieval Europe, wealth was not as fluid as it is today. Coins were heavy, difficult to transport discreetly, and often marked with regional mints, making them traceable. Land, another common promise, was even more problematic, claiming a plot required legal documentation, which an assassin, often a fugitive or outcast, could not secure without exposing themselves. Even when payment was received, it was rarely a clean transaction. A noble might hand over a purse of coins only to have their men follow the assassin, ready to reclaim the money through violence. A merchant might promise goods, food, clothing, or passage on a ship only to deliver substandard items or betray the assassin to authorities. Every transaction was a potential trap, requiring the assassin to remain vigilant even after the job was done. The societal context of medieval Europe amplified these risks. Communities were small and interconnected, with gossip spreading quickly and strangers viewed with suspicion. An assassin who suddenly appeared with wealth beyond their apparent station, new clothes, a horse, or even a hearty meal could spark rumors that led to their undoing. In a village where everyone knew each other's business, an unfamiliar, face-spending coin was a curiosity, and curiosity often led to questions. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and local lords were quick to investigate, especially if a high-profile murder had occurred nearby. For the assassin, blending in was essential, but their very existence made them conspicuous. They had to move carefully, perhaps, trading their earnings in small increments, dealing only with those who could be trusted to keep silent, or leaving the region entirely to start anew. This need for secrecy extended to every aspect of their lives. An assassin could not afford to form attachments or settle in one place for long. A single careless moment boasting about a job in a tavern, confiding in a lover, or lingering too long in a village could lead to exposure. Some assassins adopted false identities, posing as pilgrims, laborers, or wandering traders to deflect suspicion. Others relied on bribes, paying off innkeepers or merchants to vouch for them or provide alibis. These strategies, however, required resources and connections that many assassins lacked, leaving them vulnerable to betrayal at every turn. The psychological toll of this constant deception and uncertainty was profound. Assassins lived in a state of perpetual paranoia, unable to trust anyone, including those who had hired them. The knowledge that their employers could turn on them at any moment created a life of relentless tension, where every interaction was a potential threat. This isolation was compounded by the moral weight of their actions. Many assassins were driven to their trade by desperation, not a desire for violence, and the act of killing, especially when it involved betrayal by those they served, could leave deep emotional scars. They had no one to confide in, no one to share the burden of their choices, making their existence a lonely, harrowing ordeal. The broader context of medieval power dynamics further stacked the odds against assassins. Employers, often members of the elite, held all the cards. They had the resources to hire guards, bribe officials, or manipulate legal systems to protect themselves. An assassin, by contrast, was typically a nobody, a peasant, a fugitive, or a disgraced soldier with no social standing or legal recourse. If betrayed, They could not appeal to the courts or seek justice. They were outlaws in every sense, marked by their actions and their status. This power imbalance meant that employers could act with impunity, using assassins as disposable tools in their schemes and discarding them when they were no longer useful. In some cases, the betrayal was not immediate, but part of a longer game. An employer might string an assassin along, promising future jobs or greater rewards to keep them loyal, only to betray them when a more convenient opportunity arose. This manipulation could trap an assassin in a cycle of dependency, forcing them to take on increasingly dangerous missions in the hope of finally securing the wealth they had been promised. Each job deepened their entanglement in a web of deceit, making escape all but impossible. The stories of Guillaume and others, like him, though rare in historical records, reflect a broader truth about the assassin's life. It was a precarious existence, where trust was a fatal weakness. Every mission was a gamble, not just against the target's defenses, but against the treachery of those who had hired them. The promise of payment was a lure, but the reality was often a trap, leaving assassins to navigate a world where betrayal was as certain as death. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the tools they used, the disguises they wore, and the relentless dangers they faced, painting a fuller picture of a life defined by deception and the constant shadow of betrayal. The arsenal of a medieval assassin bore no resemblance to the sleek, high-tech gadgets of modern fiction or the romanticized depictions of retractable blades and elegant vials of poison found in films and novels. In the harsh reality of the medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to 15th centuries, assassins operated with whatever they could scavenge, steal, or repurpose from their environment. Their tools were not the products of skilled craftsmen or secret guilds, but the cast-offs of a brutal world: daggers pilfered from a drunk guard, ropes scavenged from a stable, or stones picked up from a muddy road. These items were chosen not for their sophistication, but for their silence, concealability, and availability, as anything that clanked, shone, or drew attention could betray an assassin's presence in a heartbeat. Every mission was a high-stakes gamble, where the choice of tool could mean the difference between success and a gruesome death. And the assassin's resourcefulness was born of desperation as much as ingenuity. The simplicity of an assassin's toolkit reflected their place on society's fringes. Unlike knights or soldiers, who might wield finely crafted swords or wear armor forged by skilled blacksmiths, assassins were typically peasants, outcasts, or fugitives with no access to such luxuries. A dagger, often their primary weapon, was rarely a purpose-built tool of assassination. More likely, it was a blade stolen from a guard during a moment of inattention, its edge dulled by years of use or marred by rust. These daggers were small enough to hide under a cloak or in a boot, but their condition made them unreliable. Dull blades required more force, increasing the risk of a messy, noisy kill that could alert nearby guards. A rope, another common tool, might be scavenged from a barn or a dock, its frayed fibers barely strong enough to strangle a target or aid in climbing a wall. Even a stone, picked up from the ground, could serve as a weapon in a pinch, used to bludgeon a target or distract a guard. These makeshift tools were not chosen for their elegance, but for their practicality, as anything too conspicuous. A polished blade, a heavy club, could draw suspicion in a society where strangers were already viewed with mistrust. Poison, often romanticized as the assassin's weapon of choice, was far less reliable than its cinematic portrayals suggest. In an era before modern chemistry, poisons were crude, concocted from whatever toxic substances an assassin could access. Common herbs like hemlock or nightshade, mushrooms gathered from damp forests, or venom extracted from snakes or toads. These concoctions were unpredictable at best. A dose intended to kill might only sicken the target, leaving them alive to raise the alarm or seek retribution. The preparation of poison was itself a risky endeavor, as assassins lacked the knowledge or equipment to ensure consistency. A poorly mixed brew could be too weak to work, or worse, harm the assassin during preparation. Historical accounts, though, rare, mention such failures. In 14th century Italy, a servant attempting to poison a noble's wine used a concoction of crushed herbs that caused only nausea, leading to her swift capture and interrogation. The unreliability of poison was compounded by the difficulty of administering it. Kitchens in noble households were closely guarded, with servants and food tasters employed to detect tampering. An assassin caught slipping a substance into a dish or goblet faced immediate capture, followed by brutal interrogation to uncover their employer or accomplices. The act of delivering poison required not just access, but cunning. An assassin might pose as a kitchen worker or bribe a servant to gain entry, but even then, the presence of taster servants tasked with sampling food and drink before it reached the target made success unlikely. In wealthier households, tasters were a standard precaution, especially for those who feared assassination, such as bishops or lords embroiled in political feuds. Even if the poison reached the target, its effects were often slow or inconsistent, giving guards time to react or physicians time to intervene. The risks were enormous, and the payoff uncertain, making poison a last resort for most assassins rather than the elegant weapon of legend. Improvisation was the cornerstone of an assassin's approach to their craft. With no access to specialized equipment, they had to make do with whatever was at hand, turning everyday objects into tools of their trade. A rusty nail, scavenged from a broken crate, could be used to pick a crude lock or pry open a window. A broken bottle, its jagged edges wrapped in cloth to avoid cutting the wielder, could serve as a makeshift blade in a desperate moment. A heavy cloak, tattered and unremarkable, could muffle the sound of a struggle or conceal a weapon from prying. Eyes, even a handful of dirt or gravel, could be thrown to distract a guard, buying precious seconds to slip past a patrol. These improvised tools reflected the assassin's resourcefulness, but they also underscored their desperation. Every mission was a high-stakes gamble, with a wrong tool a rope that snapped, a blade that broke, or a poison that failed could lead to failure, capture, or death. The physical environment of medieval Europe added another layer of complexity to the assassin's toolkit. Castles, manors, and monasteries were designed to thwart intruders, with narrow corridors, heavy doors, and vigilant guards. An assassin's tools had to be concealable, as anything too bulky or conspicuous could arouse suspicion. A dagger tucked into a belt might pass unnoticed, but a sword or axe was impossible to hide. Silence was equally critical. Metal weapons that clanked against stone or armor could betray an assassin's presence in a quiet hallway. This need for stealth drove assassins to rely on unconventional tools, such as a garrote made from twisted cloth or a wooden club carved from a tree branch. These items were less likely to draw attention, but required skill and strength to use effectively. Adding to the assassin's burden, the lack of reliable tools forced assassins to develop a keen sense of their surroundings, exploiting whatever resources were available. In a bustling market, an assassin might steal a knife from a butcher's stall, using it for a quick strike before discarding it to avoid being caught with evidence. In a rural manor, they might repurpose a pitchfork or a length of chain, turning farm tools into weapons. In urban settings, where crowds provided cover, assassins might use the chaos of a festival or market day to their advantage, blending in while carrying a concealed weapon. This adaptability was born of necessity, as assassins had no one to supply them with better options or teach them more effective methods. Their training was a matter of survival, learning through trial and error what worked and what didn't, often at great personal cost. Historical records, though sparse, offer glimpses into the improvisational nature of an assassin's arsenal. In 13th century Germany, a man caught attempting to kill a local lord was found with a crude knife made from a sharpened piece of iron, likely scavenged from a blacksmith's scraps. His attempt failed when the blade snapped during the struggle, highlighting the fragility of such tools. In another case, from 12th century England, a woman used a mixture of crushed berries and herbs to poison a bishop's ale, only to be betrayed when the concoction caused vomiting rather than death. These accounts, though brief, illustrate the makeshift nature of an assassin's tools and the constant risk of failure they carried. The reliance on improvisation extended beyond weapons to the broader strategies of assassination. An assassin might use a broken barrel stave to wedge a door shut, delaying pursuers during an escape. A handful of ash from a fireplace could be thrown into a guard's face, creating a momentary distraction. Even clothing played a role. Tattered cloaks or hoods could conceal identity, while a stolen servant's tunic might grant access to a restricted area. These strategies required a deep understanding of the environment, as well as the ability to think quickly under pressure. An assassin had to anticipate how their tools would perform in the chaos of a mission, where a single failure, a rope that frayed, a lock that wouldn't budge, could mean the difference between life and death. The psychological toll of relying on such unreliable tools was significant. Assassins lived with the constant knowledge that their equipment could fail them at any moment. A dull blade might require multiple strikes, prolonging the act and increasing the risk of detection. A poorly made poison could backfire, harming the assassin or alerting the target. The uncertainty of their tools added to the already immense pressure of their work, forcing them to plan for every contingency while knowing that some factors were beyond their control. This uncertainty bred paranoia, as assassins had to question not only their own skills, but the reliability of the objects they depended on. The societal context of medieval Europe further complicated the assassin's use of tools. Weapons, even simple ones, were regulated in many regions, and carrying a blade without justification could mark someone as a criminal. Assassins had to be cautious about how they acquired and carried their tools, often stealing or bartering in secret to avoid detection. Markets and taverns were common places to acquire weapons, but these transactions carried risk. Sellers could report suspicious buyers to the authorities, or stolen goods could be recognized by their rightful owners. The need for secrecy shaped every decision, from the choice of weapon to the way it was concealed. In the end, the weapons and improvised tools of a medieval assassin were a testament to their resourcefulness and desperation. They operated with whatever they could find or steal, turning the detritus of their world into instruments of death. Their reliance on crude daggers, unreliable poisons, and makeshift tools reflected the harsh realities of their existence. No support, no training, and no safety net. Every mission was a gamble, where the wrong tool or a moment's hesitation could lead to failure, capture, or a gruesome end. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the challenges of reaching their targets, the disguises they wore, and the relentless dangers that defined their lives, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as perilous as it was unforgiving. Reaching a target was often the most formidable hurdle in a medieval assassin's mission, a task that demanded not only physical prowess, but an almost superhuman blend of cunning, patience, and sheer luck. In the medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to 15th centuries, the powerful nobles, bishops, and royalty lived in fortresses designed to thwart any intruder, whether a rival army or a lone killer. Castles and manors were not mere residences but impregnable strongholds, bristling with defenses like deep moats filled with fetid water, towering stone walls that loomed under moonless skies, and heavy gates reinforced with iron that could be slammed shut at the first sign of trouble. These fortifications were a testament to the paranoia of the elite, built to protect their wealth and power from threats both external and internal. For an assassin, often an outcast with limited resources, breaching these barriers was a logistical nightmare, requiring days or even weeks of meticulous planning, reconnaissance, and a willingness to endure extreme hardship. Every step toward the target was fraught with peril, where a single miscalculation could lead to capture, torture, or a gruesome public execution. The physical defenses of a medieval castle were a formidable adversary in themselves. Moats, often filled with stagnant water or refuse, were not just obstacles but health hazards, forcing an assassin to wade through muck that could sicken them or leave telltale stains on their clothing. Scaling a castle wall required not only strength, but ingenuity. Ropes were rare and often unreliable, and a poorly thrown grappling hook could clatter against stone, alerting guards. Even if an assassin reached the top, they faced battlements, patrolled by sentries, often veterans of local wars, who knew every shadow of the fortress. Gates, whether drawbridges or iron-bound doors, were locked at night and guarded by men trained to spot anything amiss. An assassin might attempt to bribe a guard or exploit a moment of distraction, but such opportunities were rare, and betrayal was a constant risk. A guard who took a bribe might still raise the alarm, either out of loyalty or fear of punishment. Inside the castle or manor, the challenges multiplied. The layout was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, winding staircases, and heavy wooden doors, many of which were locked or barred. Creaky floorboards, common even the grandest halls, could betray a stealthy approach with a single step. Torches cast flickering shadows that played tricks on the eyes, making it hard to distinguish a guard from a statue or a doorway from a dead end. Dogs, kept for both companionship and security, were a constant threat, their keen senses able to detect an intruder long before human eyes. A single bark could rouse an entire household, turning a silent infiltration into a desperate scramble. Servants, though often overlooked, were another layer of defense. Trained to be vigilant, they were quick to report anything unusual. A stranger in the courtyard, a shadow in the hall, or an unfamiliar face among the staff. Their loyalty to their masters, whether born of fear or devotion, made them as dangerous as armed guards to an assassin's plans. The targets themselves were rarely careless, their lives shaped by the constant threat of betrayal or assassination. Nobles and clergy, aware of their enemies, took elaborate precautions to protect themselves. They slept in chambers secured by multiple locked doors, often with guards stationed outside or even inside the room. Some kept trusted retainers nearby, ready to respond to any disturbance, while others slept with a dagger under their pillow, their paranoia honed by years of political intrigue. Access to these chambers was tightly controlled, with keys held by only the most loyal servants. An assassin might spend days observing a household, noting who carried the keys or when the guards changed shifts. But even this information was unreliable. Routines could change without warning, and a single oversight could foil the entire plan. Feasts, which might seem like ideal opportunities for an assassin, were in reality heavily monitored. These events, common among the elite, were occasions for both celebration and political maneuvering, and security was paramount. Food and drink were sampled by tasters, servants trained to detect poison by taking the first bite or sip. These tasters were often expendable, their lives a small price to pay for their master's safety, but their presence made poisoning a risky and unreliable strategy. Guards stood watch over the hall, their eyes scanning the crowd for anyone out of place, a servant lingering too long near the Lord's table, a guest whose demeanor seemed off. Even the guests themselves, often allies or rivals of the host, were potential threats, their own agendas adding to the tension. An assassin posing as a guest or servant had to navigate this web of suspicion, blending in perfectly while carrying a concealed weapon or poison, all without arousing the slightest hint of doubt. Drunkenness, which might lower a target's guard. Often complicated rather than simplified, an assassin's task. A feast could devolve into chaos as wine and ale flowed, but this chaos was a double-edged sword. Intoxicated guards were unpredictable, their reactions ranging from sluggish indifference to sudden bursts of aggression. A drunk target might be less aware, but also harder to isolate, surrounded by boisterous companions or collapsing into a stupor in a crowded hall. For an assassin, indulging in drink was a dangerous temptation. Alcohol dulled the senses, slowed reflexes, and clouded judgment, increasing the risk of a fatal mistake. A misstep during a feast, spilling a goblet, stumbling over a bench, or drawing attention with nervous behavior, could unravel the mission before it even began. The physical environment of medieval Europe added further layers of difficulty. Castles and manors were often situated in strategic locations, on hilltops, surrounded by forests, or along rivers, making approach and escape treacherous. Dirt paths leading to a castle could turn to mud in a sudden rain, slowing an assassin's movements and leaving tracks that could be followed. Cold nights, common in much of Europe, made hiding outdoors a test of endurance, with frostbite or hypothermia a real danger for someone waiting hours in a ditch or under a hedge. Wind could carry sounds, amplifying the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, while fog, though offering cover, could disorient an assassin unfamiliar with the terrain. These natural elements were as much a foe as any human guard, forcing assassins to plan for every contingency while knowing that some factors were beyond their control. Reconnaissance was critical but perilous. An assassin might spend days or weeks observing their target's stronghold, hiding in nearby woods, posing as a beggar in a nearby village, or blending into a market crowd to gather information. They needed to learn the routines of guards, the habits of servants, and the layout of the building where the target slept, where they dined, and when they were most vulnerable. This required patience and a keen eye for detail, but it also exposed the assassin to risk. Lingering too long in one place could draw suspicion, especially in small communities where strangers were noticed. A villager might report a loiterer to the local lord, or a guard might spot a figure watching from the trees. Even the act of gathering information could lead to capture, as assassins had no legal standing to explain their presence. Historical accounts, though sparse, offer glimpses of these challenges. In 12th century England, a man named Robert, described as a vagrant in court records, attempted to infiltrate a noble's manor to kill a rival lord. He spent days hiding in a nearby forest, observing the guard patrols and noting when the lord retired to his chamber. His plan was foiled when a servant, sent to fetch water from a nearby stream, spotted him in the underbrush and raised the alarm. Robert was captured and executed, his body displayed as a warning to others. Such stories highlight the razor-thin margin for error in an assassin's work. Another account from 13th century France describes a woman who posed as a washerwoman to gain access to a bishop's residence. She spent weeks ingratiating herself with the household, only to be caught when a guard noticed her lingering near a locked door. These tales, though brief, underscore the immense difficulty of reaching a target in a world designed to protect the powerful. The psychological toll of these challenges was profound. Assassins operated under constant stress, knowing that every step toward their target increased the risk of discovery. The need for absolute precision, moving silently, timing their approach perfectly, anticipating every obstacle required. A level of focus that was exhausting to maintain. The fear of failure was ever present, as a single mistake could lead to capture, interrogation, and a death designed to be as painful and public as possible. This pressure was compounded by the isolation of their work. Assassins had no allies to rely on, no one to share the burden of their fears. They carried the weight of their mission alone, their minds racing with the possibilities of what could go wrong. The societal context of medieval Europe further stacked the odds against assassins. The elite were not just protected by physical barriers, but by a social order that valued their lives above all others. Guards and servants were loyal, often out of fear of punishment or hope of reward, and their vigilance made infiltration a daunting task. The powerful were also deeply paranoid, their lives shaped by the constant threat of betrayal. This paranoia led to elaborate security measures, secret passages known only to the Lord, decoy chambers to confuse intruders, and even spies within the household to root out disloyalty. An assassin had to navigate this web of suspicion, where every servant was a potential informant and every guard a potential killer. Even when an assassin reached their target, the act itself was only the beginning. Escaping after a kill was often as difficult as reaching the target, with guards roused, gates locked, and search parties dispatched. The assassin had to plan their exit as carefully as their approach, identifying escape routes, hiding places, or distractions to cover their retreat. A single oversight, a locked gate, a dead-end corridor, or a pursuing dog could trap them within the stronghold, turning a successful kill into a death sentence. In the end, the challenges of reaching a target were a microcosm of the assassin's life, relentless, unforgiving, and defined by danger at every turn. Every mission was a delicate dance through a maze of obstacles, where physical barriers, vigilant defenders, and unpredictable elements like weather or chance conspired to thwart their plans. The assassin's success depended on their ability to anticipate and overcome these challenges, but the odds were always against them. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the disguises they wore, the betrayals they faced, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as perilous as it was thankless. The cinematic image of a medieval assassin gliding through the night in a sleek black cloak, blending seamlessly into the shadows, is a captivating but entirely fictional trope. In the reality of the medieval period, from roughly the 5th to 15th centuries, assassins relied on disguises that were far less glamorous and often bordered on the absurd. Far from the tailored outfits of modern fiction, their disguises were cobbled together from the scraps of everyday life. Monks' robes pilfered from a monastery, tattered peasant tunics, or guard uniforms stolen in a moment of opportunity. These garments were typically ill-fitting, patched, or caked with grime, reflecting the assassin's status as an outcast with little access to quality clothing. Rather than deflecting attention, a poorly chosen or poorly executed disguise could draw suspicion, especially if the assassin's nervousness, unfamiliarity with their assumed role, or a single careless detail betrayed them. The art of disguise was a critical yet precarious part of an assassin's toolkit, where every choice carried the risk of exposure, and blending in was as much about luck as it was about skill. In medieval society, where appearances were closely scrutinized, blending in was a matter of survival. The rigid social hierarchy meant that everyone had a place, and deviations from that place were noticed. A stranger in a village or a figure out of place in a castle courtyard was immediately suspect. Assassins, often drawn from society's margins, peasants, fugitives, or disgraced soldiers, had to adopt personas that allowed them to move unnoticed among their targets' households or communities. Common disguises included those of monks, pilgrims, laborers, or servants, roles that were ubiquitous and unlikely to arouse suspicion. A monk's robe, with its voluminous hood, could conceal a face or a weapon, while a peasant's tunic, worn and unremarkable, allowed an assassin to blend into a crowd of workers. Guard uniforms, though harder to obtain, offered access to restricted areas, but required the assassin to mimic the posture and behavior of a trained soldier, a challenge for those unaccustomed to such roles. The quality of these disguises was often abysmal, reflecting the assassin's limited resources. A stolen monk's robe might be frayed or stained, its hem too short or too long, revealing boots or legs that didn't match the pious persona. A peasant's tunic, patched from years of use, could unravel at the wrong moment, exposing a hidden dagger or marking the wearer as an outsider. Guard uniforms, if stolen, were rarely a perfect fit, too tight to conceal a weapon or too loose to move quickly, increasing the risk of detection. The filthiness of these garments was another hurdle. Assassins, often living on the run, had little opportunity to clean or maintain their clothing, and a conspicuously dirty figure in a noble's pristine hall could draw unwanted attention. The very act of acquiring a disguise was fraught with danger. Stealing a robe from a monastery or a uniform from a guardhouse required boldness and risked immediate capture if caught. Hiding weapons within these disguises was a constant challenge. A dagger, the assassin's most common tool, had to be concealed carefully to avoid detection. Tucked under a cloak or inside a sleeve, it could shift or clank at the worst possible moment, alerting a vigilant guard or servant. Larger weapons, like a short sword or club, were nearly impossible to hide, forcing assassins to rely on smaller, less reliable tools like knives or garrotes made from rope or cloth. Even these had to be positioned carefully. A blade sewn into a hem could tear the fabric, while a rope coiled around the waist might be mistaken for a belt, but could slip during movement. The need for concealability often trumped effectiveness, leaving assassins with tools that were as likely to fail as to succeed. A rusty dagger might jam in its sheath, or a poorly tied garrote might snap under pressure, turning a planned kill into a chaotic struggle. More elaborate disguises, such as posing as a traveling merchant or pilgrim, required props and a convincing backstory, skills that most assassins lacked. A merchant's guise demanded goods to sell cloth, spices, or trinkets along with a plausible explanation for their presence, which could be difficult for an illiterate peasant or fugitive to maintain. Pilgrims, common in medieval Europe, needed a staff, a cloak, and a knowledge of religious customs to pass scrutiny, especially in a monastery or church, where clergy might question their credentials. These roles required not just physical props, but the ability to mimic speech patterns, mannerisms, and social cues, a tall order for someone whose life had been spent in survival rather than performance. A nervous glance, a stammered response, or an unfamiliarity with local customs could unravel the deception, turning a carefully planned disguise into a death sentence. Historical accounts, though rare, provide vivid examples of disguises gone wrong. In 14th century Italy, a man attempting to infiltrate a noble's household posed as a monk, using a robe stolen from a nearby monastery. His plan fell apart when a servant noticed that his robe was too short, revealing muddy boots that no true monk would wear, leading to his capture and execution. Another account from 13th century France describes a woman who posed as a servant to gain access to a bishop's kitchen, only to be caught when her unfamiliarity with the household's routines raised suspicion. These stories highlight the precarious nature of disguises, where a single detail, a mismatched garment, an awkward gesture, or an ill-timed movement could betray the assassin's true purpose. The societal context of medieval Europe made disguises both necessary and challenging. Communities were small and tightly knit, with strangers viewed with suspicion, especially in the wake of a high-profile crime. In a village, everyone knew their neighbors, and an unfamiliar face claiming to be a pilgrim or laborer was likely to be questioned. In castles or manors, servants and guards were trained to notice anything out of place, from a new face among the staff to a guest whose behavior didn't align with their claimed status. This vigilance forced assassins to perfect their disguises, but perfection was nearly impossible given their limited resources and lack of training. A poorly fitting disguise could draw as much attention as no disguise at all. while a convincing one required a level of preparation and finesse that most assassins, driven by desperation rather than skill, could not muster. The psychological toll of maintaining a disguise added another layer of difficulty. Assassins had to embody their assumed roles completely, suppressing their fear and paranoia while interacting with those who could expose them. A moment of hesitation, a nervous tick, or a glance at the wrong time could arouse suspicion, turning a servant's curiosity into a guard's interrogation. This constant performance was exhausting, requiring assassins to remain alert while appearing relaxed, to speak confidently while hiding their terror. The knowledge that their disguise was often their only shield against discovery heightened this stress, as did the awareness that even a successful mission could lead to betrayal or pursuit, rendering their efforts moot. The physical act of wearing a disguise was itself a challenge. Heavy robes or cloaks could hinder movement, especially during a climb or a quick escape. Ill-fitting garments could snag on obstacles, slow an assassin down, or reveal a hidden weapon at the worst moment. In cold or wet weather, a disguise could become a liability-sodden cloth weighed down the wearer, while a hood blown back by wind could expose their face. The need to carry prop stools, goods, or religious symbols added to the burden, as these had to be managed without drawing attention or slowing the assassin's movements. The improvisational nature of disguises reflected the broader reality of an assassin's life. With no access to specialized equipment or training, they had to make do with what they could find or steal. A cloak might be taken from a sleeping beggar, a tunic from a laundry line, or a staff from a discarded pile of wood. These items were often in poor condition, requiring quick repairs or adjustments to pass muster. An assassin might spend hours sewing a torn hem or staining a garment to match the local style, all while hiding from prying eyes. This resourcefulness was a testament to their survival instincts, but it also underscored their desperation. Every disguise was a gamble, and every mission a test of their ability to blend into a world that was inherently hostile to them. The reliance on disguises also highlighted the assassin's isolation. They had no allies to help them acquire or maintain their costumes, no one to vouch for their assumed identities. Even other criminals, thieves, or mercenaries kept their distance, wary of associating with someone whose actions could bring down the wrath of the powerful. This solitude forced assassins to rely on their own wits, piecing together disguises from whatever was at hand and hoping they would hold up under scrutiny. The constant need to adapt and improvise added to the mental strain, as every decision carried the weight of potential exposure. In the end, the ridiculous disguises of medieval assassins were a microcosm of their precarious existence. Far from the sleek cloaks of fiction, their disguises were makeshift, often absurd, and always risky. They relied on stolen or scavenged garments, hoping to pass as monks, peasants, or servants in a society quick to notice outsiders. Hiding weapons within these disguises was a constant challenge, as was maintaining the facade under Irono, diem papal, que no dominavem. As falas, muitas vezes fate, dessas fantasias destacavam a fragilidade de sua existência, onde cada missão era jogo de vida ou morte disfarçado em roupas maltrapilhas. À medida que continuamos esta exploração, mergulharemos nas solitudes que definiram suas vidas, nas trechos que enfrentarão e nas consequências brutais de suas falas, pintando quadro mais completo de uma profissão tão perigosa quanto desprovida de glória. The life of a medieval assassin was defined by a profound and unrelenting isolation, a solitude so deep it permeated every aspect of their existence. In a world where trust was a rare and dangerous luxury, assassins were cut off from the bonds that sustained most people, friends, family, lovers, or even casual acquaintances. These connections, vital for emotional and social survival in the medieval period, or impossible for those who walked the path of assassination. The risk of betrayal was ever present. A careless word to a friend could lead to exposure. A confidant could turn informant for a reward, and even a loved one might unwittingly reveal their secrets under pressure. Even among society's underbelly, thieves, bandits, or mercenaries, assassins were shunned, viewed as dangerous liabilities whose actions could bring the wrath of powerful enemies. This forced an assassin into a life of constant movement, never lingering in one place long enough to form connections, always a stranger in a world that demanded community for survival. They were ghosts in their own lives, drifting through medieval society without ever belonging, their existence marked by a loneliness that was as crushing as the dangers they faced in medieval Europe. From the 5th to the 15th centuries, community was the cornerstone of existence. Villages, towns, and even noble households were tightly knit, with relationships forged through shared labor, faith, and mutual dependence. For most, identity was tied to family, guild, or lord, providing a sense of place and purpose. But for assassins, these ties were severed, either by choice or necessity. Many were outcasts, peasants who had lost their land, soldiers disgraced or discharged, or fugitives fleeing justice who had already been cast out of their communities before taking up their deadly trade. Becoming an assassin only deepened this isolation, as their actions placed them beyond the pale of even the most marginal social groups. A thief might share a drink with a bandit, but an assassin, whose work invited intense scrutiny and retribution, was a pariah even among criminals. This ostracism forced them to live on the fringes, moving from village to village, town to town, never daring to stay long enough to be recognized or remembered. The inability to form connections was not just a practical necessity, but a survival mechanism. Trust was a fatal weakness in an assassin's world. A friend could be bribed or coerced into betraying them, revealing their identity or plans to local authorities or a vengeful employer. A lover, however well-meaning, might let slip a detail in a moment of vulnerability, exposing the assassin to capture. Even family members, often the last refuge for the desperate, where risk lords and sheriffs were known to interrogate relatives to uncover a fugitive's whereabouts. This constant threat of betrayal meant that assassins had to sever all ties, abandoning those they cared about to protect both themselves and their loved ones. For many, this meant leaving behind parents, siblings, or children, knowing they might never see them again. The emotional weight of this decision was immense, adding to the psychological burden of a life already fraught with danger. The solitude of an assassin's life took a profound psychological toll. Without companionship, they faced their fears, guilt, and doubts alone, with no one to offer comfort or perspective. The nature of their work, killing in secret, often under gruesome circumstances, carried a heavy moral burden, especially in a deeply religious era where murder was a sin that could damn the soul. Assassins, often driven to their trade by desperation, rather than malice, likely grappled with the consequences of their actions. The memory of a target's pleading eyes, the weight of a life taken, or the fear of divine retribution could haunt them, but they had no one to confide in, no one to share the burden. This isolation amplified their paranoia, as every stranger was a potential threat, every glance a possible prelude to betrayal. The psychological strain of knowing each mission could be their last, whether due to capture, betrayal, or a botched job, created a life of relentless tension, where moments of peace were as rare as moments of safety. The constant movement required by their trade further deepened this loneliness. An assassin could not afford to linger in one place, as staying too long risked recognition or discovery. A successful mission might force them to flee a region entirely, as the death of a noble or cleric stirred up search parties and heightened scrutiny. Even a failed attempt could mark them as a wanted criminal, forcing them to abandon any semblance of a home. This nomadic existence meant living in the shadows, hiding in forests, squatting in abandoned hovels, or blending into the transient crowds of markets and fairs. They might pose as pilgrims, laborers, or beggars to avoid suspicion. But these roles were fleeting, offering no real connection to the people around them. The assassin's life was one of perpetual displacement, a rootless existence where every step took them further from the possibility of belonging. The societal context of medieval Europe exacerbated this isolation. Communities were small and insular, with strangers viewed with suspicion, especially in the wake of a crime. In a village, everyone knew their neighbors, and an unfamiliar face was a topic of gossip, if not outright alarm. In castles or manors, servants and guards were trained to notice outsiders, making it difficult for an assassin to integrate even temporarily. This scrutiny forced assassins to remain on the periphery, interacting with others only as necessary and always under false pretenses. A tavern might offer a moment's respite, but lingering too long or speaking too freely could lead to exposure. A marketplace might provide cover, but a careless purchase or a recognized face could spark questions. The assassin had to navigate this world with constant vigilance, knowing that any interaction could be their undoing. Even among other criminals, assassins found no camaraderie. Thieves and bandits, though operating outside the law, often worked in loose networks, sharing resources or information to survive. But assassins were different. Their actions carried far greater consequences, inviting the wrath of lords, clergy, or entire communities. A thief might steal a purse and escape with a whipping, but an assassin's crime could destabilize a region, making them a target for both justice and vengeance. This made them liabilities, shunned by even the most hardened outlaws. A mercenary might share a campfire with a thief, but an assassin was too dangerous to associate with, their presence a magnet for trouble. This rejection left assassins utterly alone, unable to find solace even among those who shared their lawless existence. The psychological impact of this isolation was compounded by the nature of their work. Each mission required them to confront death, not just the death of their target, but their own mortality. The knowledge that a single mistake, a creaking floorboard, a suspicious guard, or a betrayal by their employer could lead to capture, torture, or execution hung over them. Like a dark cloud, this constant fear eroded their mental resilience, leaving them to wrestle with anxiety and dread in solitude. The moral weight of their actions added to this burden. Many assassins were not hardened killers, but desperate individuals, peasants, soldiers, or outcasts who had been pushed into their trade by circumstance. The act of killing, even if justified by necessity or the target's corruption, could leave deep emotional scars, with no one to offer absolution or understanding. Historical records, though sparse, offer glimpses into this lonely existence. A 13th century chronicle from France mentions a nameless wanderer who was caught after attempting to kill a noble. The record notes that he had no kin or companions, living alone in the forests for months before his capture. Another account from 12th century England describes a woman who poisoned a bishop's wine, only to be betrayed by a servant she had confided in, highlighting the dangers of even fleeting trust. These stories, though brief, underscore the solitude that defined an assassin's life. Where connections were a risk, they could not afford. The physical toll of this isolation was significant as well. Living on the run meant enduring harsh conditions, sleeping in ditches, hiding in barns, or braving the elements with little shelter. Hunger was a constant companion, as assassins had to avoid drawing attention by purchasing food in villages or towns. Illness was a frequent threat, with no access to physicians or healers, and a minor injury could become life-threatening without care. The lack of companionship meant no one to tend their wounds, share their burdens, or watch their back, leaving them vulnerable in a world that was already hostile. The assassins' isolation also shaped their interactions with their employers. These relationships were purely transactional, marked by mutual distrust. An employer might promise wealth or protection, but the assassin knew better than to rely on such assurances. Betrayal was common, with employers refusing payment or ordering the assassin's death to cover their tracks. This dynamic reinforced the assassin's solitude, as even those who hired them were potential enemies. The need to negotiate carefully demanding partial payment up front, using intermediaries, or arranging secret meeting points required a level of cunning that further isolated them, as every interaction was a potential trap. The emotional and psychological strain of this life cannot be overstated. Assassins lived in a state of constant paranoia, their minds racing with the possibilities of betrayal, capture, or failure. The absence of companionship meant they had no outlet for their fears, no one to share the weight of their choices. In a society where faith was a cornerstone, many likely grappled with the spiritual consequences of their actions, fearing divine judgment for their sins. Yet they had no priest to confess to, no community to offer redemption. Their lives were a solitary dance with death, where every step was taken alone, and every moment was a reminder of their disconnection from the world around them. In the end, the isolation and loneliness of a medieval assassin were not just byproducts of their trade, but defining features of their existence. They were cut off from society, shunned by even the most marginal groups, and forced to navigate a world where trust was a fatal flaw. Their constant movement, driven by the need to avoid detection, left them rootless, while the psychological toll of their work guilt, fear, and paranoia eroded their mental resilience. They were ghosts, moving through a society they could never belong to, their lives marked by a solitude as profound as the dangers they faced. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the consequences of their failures, the fleeting moments of success, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as lonely as it was perilous. For a medieval assassin, failure was not merely a setback or a missed opportunity. It was a death sentence that transformed a solitary figure into a hunted criminal, pursued with relentless ferocity by both their target's allies and their own employers. In the medieval world, spanning roughly from the 5th to 10th centuries, the stakes of an assassination attempt were unimaginably high, and the consequences of a botched mission were as gruesome as they were inevitable. A single mistake dropped weapon, a witness's cry, or a misstep in the dark could unravel days or weeks of planning, thrusting the assassin into a nightmare of pursuit, capture, and punishment. Public executions were designed to be spectacles of horror, with methods like hanging, drawing, and quartering crafted not only to end the assassin's life, but to serve as a stark warning to others who might consider following their path. Assassins' low status, often a peasant, fugitive, or outcast, rendered them expendable, with no one to plead their case or shield them from the brutal justice of a society built to protect the powerful. From the moment a mission began, the assassin operated under a crushing weight of risk. Every step was a gamble, where the smallest error could lead to catastrophic consequences. A dagger slipping from a sweaty palm could clatter against a stone floor, alerting a nearby guard. A witness's cry, whether from a servant spotting a shadow or a guest noticing an unfamiliar face, could rouse an entire household, turning a stealthy infiltration into a desperate flight. Even the environment itself was a potential betrayer. Creaking floorboards, barking dogs, or a sudden gust of wind could expose an assassin's presence. The planning required to avoid these pitfalls was immense, involving days or weeks of reconnaissance to map guard patrols, study routines, and identify escape routes. Yet, no amount of preparation could eliminate the unpredictability of human behavior or the whims of chance. A guard might linger at his post, a servant might take an unexpected route, or a target might alter their habits without warning, rendering the assassin's plans obsolete. Capture was the immediate consequence of failure, and it was a fate to be dreaded. Medieval authorities did not treat suspected assassins with leniency. They were seen as threats to the social order, their actions challenging the divine right of kings, nobles, and clergy. Once caught, an assassin faced brutal interrogation, designed not only to punish, but to extract information about their employers or accomplices. Torture was a common tool, with methods like the rack, branding irons, or thumbscrews used to break the prisoner's will. The goal was twofold: to uncover the masterminds behind the plot and to serve as a deterrent to others. And assassins' low status made them particularly vulnerable. Unlike a noble or knight, who might have allies to negotiate their release, a peasant or fugitive had no one to advocate for them. Their interrogators, often acting under the orders of a lord or bishop, had little incentive to show mercy, knowing that a swift and public punishment would reinforce the power structure. Public executions were the culmination of an assassin's failure, designed to be as gruesome and terrifying as possible. Hanging was a common method, but it was rarely a quick or merciful death. The condemned might be left to strangle slowly, their body twitching for minutes as a crowd watched in grim fascination. Drawing and quartering, reserved for the most heinous. Crimes like treason or assassination attempts was even more horrific. The victim was hanged until near death, then disemboweled while still alive, their body cut into pieces and displayed in public places as a warning. Other punishments included burning at the stake, beheading, or being broken on the wheel, where the victim's limbs were shattered before they were left to die in agony. These spectacles were not just punishments, but performances, meant to instill fear and reinforce the authority of the elite. For an assassin, the knowledge that failure could lead to such a fate was a constant shadow, adding unbearable pressure to every mission dot. The societal context of medieval Europe amplified these consequences. The powerful nobles, clergy, and royalty were protected by a system that valued their lives above all others. An attack on them was an attack on the divine order, a crime that demanded the harshest retribution. Assassins, typically drawn from the lowest rungs of society, were seen as disposable, their lives worth little in the eyes of those who held power. This disparity meant that even a failed attempt could have far-reaching consequences, not just for the assassin, but for anyone associated with them. Families or villages suspected of harboring an assassin could face collective punishment fines, imprisonment, or even execution, further isolating the assassin from any hope of support or refuge. Historical accounts, though sparse, provide chilling examples of these brutal consequences. In 12th century England, a man named Hugh, described as a landless wanderer, was hired to kill a bishop who had angered a rival noble. His attempt failed when a servant spotted him hiding in a stable, leading to his capture. According to chronicles, Hugh was tortured for days, his interrogators seeking the name of his employer before being drawn and quartered in the town square. His body parts were sent to nearby villages as a warning, ensuring that his fate was known far and wide. Another account from 13th century France tells of a woman who attempted to poison a noble's wine. Her failure led to her capture, and after enduring brutal interrogation, she was burned at the stake, her execution drawing a crowd eager to see justice served. These stories, though brief, underscore the merciless fate awaiting those who failed. In their deadly trade, the fear of such consequences shaped every aspect of an assassin's approach. They had to operate with absolute precision, knowing that a single mistake could lead to their downfall. This pressure was compounded by the knowledge that their employers were often as dangerous as their targets. A botched mission could anger the person who hired them, leading to betrayal as the employer sought to distance themselves from the failure. In some cases, Employers preemptively betrayed their assassins, alerting authorities to ensure their own safety. This double threat from both the target's allies and their own patrons meant that assassins were hunted from all sides, with nowhere to turn for protection. The psychological toll of this constant danger was immense. Assassins lived in a state of perpetual paranoia, their minds racing with the possibilities of failure at every step. The knowledge that capture meant not just death, but prolonged suffering weighed heavily, eroding their mental resilience. Many were likely haunted by the faces of those they had killed or attempted to kill, their isolation leaving them no outlet for their guilt or fear. In a deeply religious age, the spiritual consequences of their actions added another layer of dread. Murder was a sin that could condemn them to eternal torment, and failure meant facing that judgment sooner rather than later. With no one to confide in, no priest to offer absolution, and no community to offer solace, assassins carried this burden alone, their loneliness amplifying their terror. The physical toll of failure was equally severe. Capture often meant immediate violence. Guards were not gentle with suspected assassins, and a beating was often the prelude to interrogation. Once imprisoned, conditions were horrific, with dank cells, meager rations, and the constant threat of torture. The assassins' low status meant they had no hope of ransom or leniency. They were at the mercy of their captors, who saw them as little more than vermin. Even if they survived interrogation, the public nature of their execution ensured that their suffering was a spectacle, watched by crowds who saw them not as individuals, but as symbols of rebellion against the natural order. The broader context of medieval justice further stacked the odds against assassins. Legal systems were designed to protect the powerful, with laws and punishments weighted heavily in their favor. An assassin caught in the act had no defense. Confessing might lead to a quicker death, but silence invited prolonged torture. The lack of formal legal representation meant that assassins faced their accusers alone, their word meaningless against the authority of a lord or bishop. Even if they named their employer, it was unlikely to save them. Powerful figures had the resources to deflect blame, leaving the assassin to bear the full weight of the crime. The consequences of failure extended beyond the individual assassin to their legacy or lack thereof. Unlike knights or nobles, whose deeds might be recorded in chronicles, assassins were erased from history, their names forgotten or deliberately omitted to protect their employers. A failed mission ensured that their suffering was in vain, their sacrifice unacknowledged. This anonymity was both a shield and a curse, protecting them from immediate recognition, but condemning them to obscurity. Their lives, already marked by isolation, ended in a final act of erasure, their stories reduced to brief mentions in court records or whispered tales of warning. In the end, the brutal consequences of failure were a defining feature of an assassin's life. Every mission was a high-stakes gamble, where the cost of a single mistake was not just the loss of reward, but the loss of life in the most horrific manner imaginable. The threat of pursuit, capture, torture, and execution hung over them like a storm cloud, shaping every decision and intensifying the loneliness and paranoia of their existence. They were expendable tools in a world that valued power above all else, their failures serving as grim reminders of the risks they took. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the fleeting moments of success, the betrayals they faced, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as merciless as it was solitary. For a medieval assassin, success in completing a mission, a rare and fleeting triumph, offered no moment of respite or celebration. The instant the target fell, whether by blade, poison, or garrote, the assassin's world transformed into a high-stakes race against time. Escape was not a mere afterthought, but a critical phase of the mission, as perilous as the act of killing itself. Medieval castles, manors, and fortified towns designed to protect the powerful, were equally adept at trapping intruders, with narrow exits, locked gates, and vigilant guards ready to respond to any disturbance. Fleeing required a blend of speed, cunning, and sheer luck, as every passing second increased the risk of capture, pursuit, or betrayal. Beyond the immediate physical dangers, a successful kill created new enemies, angry allies of the target, seeking vengeance and duplicitous. Employers eager to eliminate loose ends. Each completed mission added to the assassin's growing list of pursuers, turning their life into a relentless flight from danger, where safety was an illusion and every moment was a battle for survival. The physical act of escape was a daunting challenge, shaped by the formidable defenses of medieval strongholds. Castles, the primary residences of nobles and royalty, were engineered to thwart intruders. High stone walls, often topped with battlements, made climbing out as difficult as climbing in. Moats, filled with stagnant water or refuse, slowed movement and left tracks in the mud. Gates, whether drawbridges or iron-bound doors, were guarded day and night, and raising an alarm could see them sealed within moments. Narrow corridors and winding staircases, designed to confuse and slow attackers, became death traps for an assassin trying to flee. Even a successful kill triggered immediate chaos shouts from witnesses, barking dogs, and the clanging of bells or horns as guards were roused. The assassin had to navigate this pandemonium, slipping past patrols, avoiding dead-end passages, and finding an exit before the stronghold locked down completely. The terrain surrounding a castle or manor added further obstacles. Many strongholds were strategically placed on hilltops, surrounded by dense forests or bordered by rivers, making escape routes treacherous. A forest might offer cover, but also concealed roots and underbrush that could trip a fleeing assassin. Rivers, while tempting as an escape route, were often cold and swift, risking drowning or exposure. Muddy paths, churned by rain or livestock, slowed progress and left footprints that pursuers could follow. In urban settings, like fortified towns or cities, escape was no easier. Narrow streets teemed with people who might recognize a stranger, and city gates were often closed at night or guarded by watchmen. The assassin had to anticipate these challenges during their planning, identifying escape routes in advance, but even the best-laid plans could unravel in the chaos of the successful. Kill. Speed was critical, but it came at a cost. Moving too quickly could draw attention. A sprinting figure in a quiet courtyard was sure to arouse suspicion. Yet moving too slowly risked being overtaken by guards or trapped by a locked gate. Cunning was equally essential. An assassin might create diversions, knocking over a torch to start a small fire, scattering coins to distract a crowd, or loosing livestock to sow confusion. These tactics bought precious seconds, but required split-second decisions under immense pressure. Luck, too, played a cruel role. A sudden rainstorm might mask the sound of their footsteps, but also turn the ground to sludge. A guard distracted by a drunken brawl might provide an opening, but a vigilant one could seal their doom. Every escape was a gamble, where the odds were stacked against the assassin from the moment the blade struck. The human element added another layer of danger. Guards, often veterans of local wars, were trained to react swiftly to threats. A successful kill triggered an immediate response: shouts, alarms, and organized searches that could lock down a castle within minutes. Servants, though less combat-ready, were no less dangerous, their loyalty to their masters driving them to raise the alarm or join the pursuit. Even bystanders, whether villagers or guests, could become threats, their cries alerting others or their descriptions guiding pursuers. In a society where community vigilance was a matter of survival, an assassin stood out as an outsider, their presence a spark that could ignite a manhunt. Historical accounts, though sparse, illustrate this. Chaos. In 13th century France, A man who killed a noble in his manor escaped through a servant's passage, only to be spotted by a stable boy who alerted the guards. His brief head start was not enough, and he was captured within hours, his fate sealed. By a swift execution, success also created new enemies, multiplying the dangers an assassin faced. The death of a noble, bishop, or merchant sent ripples through their network of allies, family, and retainers, all of whom had reason to seek vengeance. A lord's kin might offer a bounty for the assassin's capture, dead or alive, turning every mercenary or villager into a potential hunter. Loyal retainers, driven by duty or grief, could pursue the assassin across regions, their resources far outstripping those of their quarry. Even distant allies, connected by politics or trade, might join the hunt, fearing the precedent set by an unpunished killing. This network of vengeance ensured that a successful mission marked the assassin as a target. Their name, if known, or description circulated among those with the power to destroy them. Perhaps the greatest threat came from the assassin's own employers. Nobles, clergy, or merchants who commissioned a killing were rarely trustworthy. Their promises of payment or protection often a lure to secure the assassin's services. Once the deed was done, the assassin became a liability, a living witness, to a crime that could ruin their employer. Betrayal was common. Some refused payment, claiming the job was poorly executed or too public. Others took more drastic measures, sending their own men to eliminate the assassin, ensuring no one could link them to the murder. This treachery turned success into a trap, as the assassin had to evade not only the target's allies, but also those they had served. A 12th century English chronicle recounts the story of a man hired to kill a bishop, only to be ambushed by his employer's guards after delivering proof of the deed. He escaped with a wound that later festered, a grim reminder of the cost of trust in a world of deceit. The aftermath of a successful kill required the assassin to disappear completely, a feat that was nearly impossible in medieval Europe's interconnected communities. Villages and towns were small, with residents quick to notice strangers, or unusual behavior. A sudden influx of wealth, whether from payment or looting, could draw suspicion, as a peasant with coin or a wanderer with new clothes stood out in a society where status was rigid. Fleeing to another region was a common strategy, but it came with risks. Travel was slow and dangerous, with bandits, tolls, and local authorities to avoid. A lone traveler, especially one carrying coin or looking disheveled from a hasty escape, was an easy target. Some assassins posed as pilgrims or merchants to blend in, but maintaining such a disguise required props and a backstory they often lacked the resources to sustain. The psychological toll of this constant flight was immense. Success brought no relief, only a new set of fears. The assassin had to remain hyper-vigilant, knowing that every face in a crowd could be an enemy, every shadow a pursuer. The adrenaline of a kill gave way to paranoia as they second-guessed every decision. Had they left tracks, been seen, or trusted the wrong person? The isolation of their trade, already profound, deepened in the aftermath of a mission, as they could not afford to confide in anyone or seek shelter with allies. Even other criminals, who might share a tavern or hideout, kept their distance, wary of associating with someone who drew such intense scrutiny. The assassin was a ghost, moving through society without belonging, their success a fleeting moment overshadowed by the endless need to run. The physical demands of escape were equally grueling. Fleeing a castle might involve climbing down a wall, in the dark, navigating a moat under moonlight, or sprinting through a forest with branches clawing at their skin. Hunger and exhaustion were constant companions, as stopping to eat or rest risked capture. Injuries sustained during the mission, a cut from a guard's sword, a twisted ankle from a fall, could slow them down, making every step a battle against pain and fatigue. The harsh climate of medieval Europe added to the ordeal rain-soaked. Clothes weighed them down. Cold nights threatened hypothermia, and heat could sap their strength. Survival required not just physical endurance, but mental fortitude, as the assassin had to push through fear and exhaustion to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. The societal context of medieval Europe made escape a near impossible feat. Communities were tightly knit, with gossip spreading quickly and strangers viewed with suspicion. A successful assassination, especially of a prominent figure, sent shockwaves through the region, prompting searches, checkpoints, and rewards for information. Villagers, eager for coin or fearful of punishment, might report a suspicious traveler. Local lords, sheriffs, or church officials could mobilize militias or hire trackers to hunt the assassin, their resources far outstripping those of their quarry. In cities, watchmen patrolled the streets, and gates were locked at night, trapping the assassin within walls as effectively as a castle. The assassin had to navigate this web of vigilance, blending into crowds or hiding in the wilderness, all carrying the weight of their crime. The long-term consequences of success were as daunting as the immediate ones. Each completed mission added to the assassin's notoriety, making them a target for anyone seeking to claim a bounty or curry favor with the powerful. Their employers, even if initially satisfied, might betray them later, fearing future exposure or pressure from the target's allies. This meant that success was not a resolution, but a new chapter in a life of flight. Some assassins sought to disappear entirely, fleeing to distant regions or even foreign lands, but such journeys were perilous and costly. Others tried to reinvent themselves, adopting new identities as laborers or pilgrims, but the shadow of their past followed them, ready to resurface with a single slip. The psychological burden of this endless flight was crushing. Success did not bring peace, but a heightened sense of vulnerability. As the assassin knew, they were now a marked figure. The guilt of their actions, already heavy, was compounded by the fear of retribution, both human and divine. In a religious age, the act of killing weighed heavily on the soul, and the assassin, cut off from confession or community, had no way to seek absolution. The paranoia of being hunted, the loneliness of having no one to trust, and the exhaustion of constant movement created a life of relentless tension, where every moment was a reminder of their precarious existence. In the end, success for a medieval assassin was not a victory, but a fleeting moment that ushered in new dangers. The immediate need to escape through guarded gates, past barking dogs, and over treacherous terrain was only the beginning. Each mission created enemies, from vengeful allies to treacherous employers, turning the assassin's life into a perpetual flight from danger. Their success was a paradox, a triumph that brought no reward, but only deepened their isolation and vulnerability. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the tools they used, the disguises they wore, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as perilous as it was unforgiving. In the medieval world, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, superstition permeated every facet of life, casting a shadow of fear and suspicion over society. For assassins, this pervasive belief in the supernatural was not just a backdrop, but a tangible threat that amplified the dangers of their trade. Far from the sleek, rational operatives of modern fiction, medieval assassins were often perceived as agents of dark forces, wielders of curses, practitioners of forbiddens arts, or even individuals who had forged pacts with demons. These perceptions, fueled by a potent mix of religious fervor, ignorance, and fear of the unknown, transformed assassins into figures of dread, blamed for unexplained deaths or misfortunes. A suspicious death, whether by blade or poison, could ignite mob hysteria, with villagers and townsfolk mobilizing to hunt the cursed assassin. driven by tales of shape-shifting or supernatural malice. This climate of superstition made every mission exponentially riskier, as a single mistake, a dropped weapon, a fleeting glimpse by a witness, or an untimely rumor could spark a witch hunt, turning the assassin into prey, not just for guards or employers, but for entire communities gripped by fear. Medieval Europe was a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was porous. The Church, a dominant force in shaping beliefs, taught that the devil and his minions were ever present, seeking to corrupt and destroy. Natural phenomena, storms, plagues, or sudden deaths were often attributed to divine wrath or demonic influence. In this context, assassins, whose work involved secretive and violent acts, were easily cast as instruments of evil. Nobles. Death by an unseen hand could be blamed on sorcery, with the assassin labeled a witch or demon in human form. Villagers whispered of shapeshifters who could slip through locked doors, or of killers who used cursed blades imbued with dark magic. These rumors were not mere folklore, but powerful forces that shaped how assassins were perceived and pursued, turning every mission into a dance with both physical and supernatural dangers. The fear of assassins as supernatural agents was rooted in the medieval worldview, where unexplained events demanded explanation through the lens of faith or superstition. A sudden death, especially of a prominent figure like a lord or bishop, was rarely seen as a simple act of murder. Instead, it was interpreted as a sign of divine judgment or demonic intervention. If a target died from poison, villagers might claim the assassin had used a potion brewed with forbidden herbs, perhaps under the guidance of a witch or devil. If an assassin escaped capture, rumors might spread that they had vanished into thin air, proof of their otherworldly nature. These beliefs were amplified by the Church, which often condemned assassins as heretics or sorcerers, their actions a defiance of God's order. Such accusations were not abstract. They could lead to real consequences as communities rallied to root out the perceived evil in their midst. The impact of these superstitions on an assassin's work was profound. Every mission carried the risk of being interpreted through a supernatural lens, making even a successful kill a potential catalyst for disaster. A botched attempt where the assassin was seen or left evidence could spark panic. For example, a dropped dagger or a bloodstain might be seen as a cursed object, prompting villagers to call for priests or witch hunters to cleanse the area. A witness's fleeting glimpse of a cloaked figure could be exaggerated into a tale of a spectral assassin, inciting mobs to scour the countryside. Historical records, though sparse, offer glimpses of this hysteria. In 13th century Germany, a failed assassination attempt on a bishop led to rumors of a demon killer haunting the region, prompting villagers to burn effigies and patrol the woods for weeks. The assassin, likely a desperate peasant, was caught not by guards, but by a mob, convinced he was a servant of Satan, his execution a ritual to appease divine wrath. This climate of fear made blending in a near impossible task. Assassins relied on disguises, monks' robes, peasant tunics, or stolen guard uniforms to move unnoticed, but superstition turned even these efforts against them. A stranger in a village, especially one behaving oddly or carrying unfamiliar items, could be accused of witchcraft or demonic possession. A monk's robe that was too short or a tunic stained with suspicious marks could be interpreted as signs of sorcery, drawing the attention of suspicious villagers or zealous clergy. In a society where the church held sway, accusations of heresy or witchcraft were as dangerous as capture by guards, as they invited not just legal punishment, but mob violence. An assassin caught in the wrong place could face a trial by ordeal, forced to grasp hot iron or endure submersion in water to prove their innocence, a test few survived. The psychological toll of operating in this superstitious world was immense. Assassins were already isolated, unable to trust friends, family, or even other criminals. But the fear of being labeled a supernatural threat deepened their paranoia. Every mission required them to anticipate not just physical obstacles, guards, walls, or dogs, but the irrational fears of those around them. A suspicious glance from a servant or a whispered rumor in a tavern could escalate into a full-blown witch hunt, with the assassin cast as the villain in a tale of demonic intrigue. This constant threat forced them to be hyper-vigilant, second-guessing every interaction and movement. The knowledge that their actions could be misinterpreted as supernatural added a layer of dread, as they risked not just capture, but being branded a monster in the eyes of a terrified community. The church's influence exacerbated these fears. Clergy often preached against the forces of evil, framing assassins as tools of the devil. A sermon following a high-profile death could whip a congregation into a frenzy, with priests calling for vigilance against agents of darkness. This rhetoric could turn entire towns against a suspected assassin, with villagers forming posses to hunt them down. In some cases, the church itself led the charge, with bishops or abbots organizing searches for the culprit, their authority lending weight to accusations of witchcraft. For an assassin, this meant that even a successful mission could have unintended consequences, as their actions stirred religious fervor that made escape or concealment nearly impossible. The fear of being labeled a witch or demon also affected how assassins planned their missions. They had to avoid behaviors or tools that could be interpreted as supernatural. For example, using poison, a common but unreliable method, was risky not just because of its unpredictability, but because it was associated with witchcraft. A vial of herbs or a strange powder could be seen as evidence of sorcery, inviting accusations that were harder to disprove than murder. Similarly, moving at night or using disguises like cloaks or hoods could be interpreted as evidence of shapeshifting or invisibility, fueling rumors that made pursuit more relentless. Assassins had to balance the need for stealth with the need to avoid appearing too mysterious, a delicate balance that required constant adaptation. The societal structure of medieval Europe amplified these dangers. Communities were small and insular, with gossip spreading like wildfire. A single rumor, perhaps, of a stranger seen near a castle before a noble's death could spiral into a narrative of demonic intervention. Villagers, fearful of divine punishment or communal blame, were quick to act, forming mobs to hunt suspected assassins or turning over strangers to local authorities. These mobs were often indiscriminate, targeting anyone who seemed out of place, from travelers to beggars. For an assassin, this meant that even a minor mistake lingering too long in a village, speaking with an unfamiliar accent, or carrying an unusual item could trigger a chain reaction of fear and violence. The consequences of being caught in such a witch hunt were dire. Unlike a standard criminal trial, where evidence might be weighed, however unfairly, accusations of witchcraft or demonic involvement were nearly impossible to refute. Trials by ordeal, where the accused were subjected to tests like grasping hot iron or being submerged in water, were common, with survival seen as proof of innocence and failure as proof of guilt. These tests were rigged against the accused, as surviving a burning iron or prolonged submersion was nearly impossible. Even if an assassin escaped immediate capture, the stigma of being labeled a sorcerer could follow them, making it impossible to find refuge or blend into another community. Execution, when it came, was often a public spectacle, with burning at the stake or hanging serving as both punishment and a communal ritual to purge evil. The isolation of an assassin's life made these fears even more oppressive. With no allies or confidants, they had no one to turn to for support or reassurance. The psychological strain of living under constant suspicion, knowing that a single misstep could cast them as a supernatural monster, was relentless. This paranoia was compounded by the moral weight of their actions. Many assassins were driven to their trade by desperation, poverty, coercion, or loss, not a desire for evil. Yet they were demonized by a society quick to see the devil's hand in any unexplained death. The fear of divine retribution, a powerful force in a religious age, added to their burden as they grappled with the belief that their sins might condemn them to eternal torment. Historical records, though sparse, offer glimpses into the impact of superstition on assassins. In 14th century Italy, a man caught attempting to kill a merchant was accused of using a cursed blade after villagers found a knife with strange markings near the scene. The markings were likely scratches from years of use, but they fueled rumors of sorcery, leading to a mob that burned him alive before a formal trial could be held. Another account from 12th century England describes a woman suspected of poisoning a lord's ale. Her use of herbs was interpreted as witchcraft, and she was subjected to a trial by water, drowning in the process. These stories, though brief, highlight how superstition turned assassins into scapegoats for a society's deepest fears, making their work exponentially more dangerous. The fear of being branded a supernatural threat also shaped how assassins operated. They had to avoid actions that could be misinterpreted as magical, such as carrying unusual items or moving in ways that seemed unnatural. This limited their options, forcing them to rely on crude, conventional methods, daggers, ropes, or blunt force rather than anything that might be seen as otherworldly. Yet even these precautions were no guarantee of safety, as the mere act of killing in secret was enough to spark rumors of demonic involvement. The assassin had to navigate a world where every villager, servant, or priest was a potential accuser, ready to see the devil in a stranger's eyes. In the end, the superstitions and fears of medieval society were not just a cultural backdrop, but a deadly force that shaped an assassin's life. Every mission was a gamble against not just guards and employers, but the irrational terrors of a society quick to see evil in the unknown. A suspicious death could ignite mob hysteria, turning villagers into hunters and assassins into prey. The fear of being labeled a witch or demon added a layer of dread to an already perilous existence, forcing assassins to operate with extreme caution while knowing that some dangers were beyond their control. Their isolation, already profound, was deepened by a world that saw them as monsters, their actions magnified into tales of supernatural horror. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the tools they used, the betrayals they faced, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as terrifying as it was solitary. Poison, often romanticized in modern fiction as the silent and elegant weapon of choice for assassins, was in the medieval world a crude, unreliable, and extraordinarily risky tool that offered little guarantee of success. Far from the precise, odorless concoctions of spy novels, medieval poisons were rudimentary, typically derived from foraged herbs, toxic plants, or animal venoms, and their effects were unpredictable at best. In the period spanning roughly from the 5th to 15th centuries, an assassin attempting to use poison faced not only the challenge of crafting or acquiring a substance potent enough to kill, but also the formidable obstacles posed by guarded kitchens, vigilant food tasters, and a superstitious society quick to attribute mysterious deaths to witchcraft. Failure often meant not just a botched mission, but capture, brutal interrogation, and a gruesome execution, making poisoning a high-stakes gamble that required immense cunning, resourcefulness, and luck. The harsh reality of poisoning underscored the desperation of assassins who turned to this method not out of preference, but as a last resort in a world where every mission was a brush with death. The creation of poison in medieval Europe was a far cry from the scientific precision of modern chemistry. Assassins, typically drawn from society's margins, peasants, fugitives, or disgraced soldiers, had no access to laboratories or trained apothecaries. Instead, they relied on folklore, hearsay, or fleeting interactions with herbalists to identify. Toxic substances. Common poisons included hemlock, nightshade, or wolfsbane, gathered from forests or fields, and mushrooms like the deathcap, whose potency varied wildly depending on season, soil, or preparation. Animal-based poisons, such as venom from snakes or toads, were even harder to obtain and handle, requiring knowledge and tools most assassins lacked. These crude concoctions were often unstable, losing potency over time, or reacting unpredictably. When mixed with food or drink, a dose intended to kill might only sicken the target, causing vomiting or fever that alerted their household to foul play, while a poorly prepared poison could harm the assassin themselves during handling, leading to illness or death before the mission even began. The process of administering poison was fraught with peril. Medieval households, especially those of nobles, clergy, or wealthy merchants, were designed to thwart such attempts. Kitchens were closely guarded, with servants trained to watch for tampering. Access to food and drink was tightly controlled, particularly in wealthier households where poisoning was a known threat. Food tasters, often expendable servants or slaves, were employed to sample every dish or goblet before it reached the target, a practice that made poisoning a noble or bishop a near impossible task. These tasters were a first line of defense, their lives sacrificed to protect their masters, and their presence forced assassins to find creative ways to bypass them, perhaps by targeting a specific dish the taster might overlook, or by poisoning a communal item like a wine cask, risking collateral damage that could spark a wider investigation. Even then, the assassin had to gain access to the kitchen, a feat that required infiltrating a household under the guise of a servant, cook, or laborer, each role demanding a convincing disguise and backstory that most assassins untrained in. Deception struggled to maintain. The unreliability of medieval poisons added another layer of risk. Unlike modern toxins, which can be calibrated for swift and certain death, medieval poisons were notoriously inconsistent. A dose of hemlock might cause paralysis and death in one victim, but only nausea in another, depending on the quantity, the victim's health, or even their last meal. Mushrooms, if improperly prepared, might lose their toxicity or cause prolonged suffering rather than a quick kill, giving the target time to summon help or identify the source of their illness. Historical records, though sparse, provide examples of such failures. In 12th century England, a woman attempting to poison a lord's ale used a mixture of crushed herbs that caused severe vomiting, but no death, leading to her capture when the lord's physician traced the symptoms to tampering. Her interrogation and subsequent burning at the stake served as a grim warning to others, highlighting the high cost of failure in such endeavors, that the act of acquiring poison was itself a dangerous undertaking. Assassins rarely had the means to purchase ready-made toxins, and even if they did, dealing with apothecaries or herbalists carried risks. These figures, often respected in their communities, were wary of sharing knowledge of poisons, knowing that association with a murder could lead to their own punishment. An assassin seeking a toxic herb might need to barter with a shady healer or steal from a monastery garden, both of which exposed them to scrutiny. In a superstitious age, carrying unusual plants or powders could mark them as a witch, inviting accusations that were as deadly as capture for murder. The mere possession of a vial or pouch of suspicious substances could trigger a trial by ordeal, where the accused faced tests like grasping hot iron or submersion in water, with survival seen as proof of innocence, a rare outcome. The societal context of medieval Europe made poisoning particularly perilous. Superstition ran rampant, and a mysterious death was often attributed to dark forces rather than human agency. A noble who died suddenly from poison might be said to have been cursed, with the assassin labeled a sorcerer or demon. This perception could spark mob hysteria, with villagers forming posses to hunt the cursed killer, driven by fear of divine retribution or communal blame. Such accusations amplified the consequences of failure, as a botched poisoning attempt could lead not just to execution, but to a public spectacle designed to purge evil. In 13th century France, a man caught attempting to poison a merchant's wine was accused of witchcraft after villagers found a pouch of herbs in his possession. The ensuing trial, fueled by rumors of demonic pacts, ended in his burning, a fate that reflected the era's blend of fear and vengeance. The psychological toll of using poison was immense. Assassins, already isolated and paranoid, faced the constant fear that their weapon could betray them. Preparing poison required handling dangerous substances without proper knowledge or protection, risking accidental poisoning or exposure. Administering it demanded nerves of steel, as the assassin had to infiltrate a guarded space, evade detection, and deliver the poison without arousing suspicion, all while knowing that failure could lead to torture. The slow-acting nature of many poisons added to this stress, as the assassin might need to linger nearby to confirm the kill, increasing the risk of capture. Even a successful poisoning offered no guarantee of safety, as the resulting chaos servants raising alarms. Guards sealing exits could trap them before they could escape. The consequences of a failed poisoning attempt were among the most brutal an assassin could face. Capture meant interrogation, often under torture, as authorities sought to uncover the assassin's employer or accomplices. Methods like the rack, branding, or thumbscrews were designed to extract confessions, and the assassin's low status, typically a peasant or outcast, meant they had no allies to plead their case. Execution was almost certain, with methods like burning at the stake or hanging serving as public spectacles to deter others. These punishments were not just about ending a life, but about reinforcing the social order, with the assassin's suffering a warning to those who dared challenge the powerful. A 14th century Italian chronicle describes a woman who failed to poison a bishop and was subjected to a trial by fire, her death witnessed by a crowd convinced she was a witch. Such accounts, though brief, underscore the dire fate awaiting those who gambled on poison and lost. The physical act of poisoning required immense precision, which was difficult to achieve with crude tools and limited knowledge. Assassins had to calculate the right dose, often without understanding the substance's potency, and deliver it in a way that avoided detection. This might involve slipping poison into a single goblet, a task complicated by the presence of tasters, or contaminating a larger batch of food or drink, risking discovery if multiple people fell ill. The delivery method, whether a powder sprinkled into wine, a liquid poured into a stew, or a tainted fruit, had to be seamless, as any hesitation or clumsy movement could alert a watchful servant. Even the choice of poison was a gamble. Some substances, like arsenic, were rare and difficult to obtain, while others, like nightshade, were common but unpredictable. The assassin had to weigh these risks against the slim chance of success, knowing that failure could mean not just death, but a legacy as a reviled figure. The societal perception of poison added another layer of danger. Unlike a dagger or garrote, which were seen as tools of human violence, poison was associated with the supernatural, its invisible nature lending it an aura of dark magic. An assassin caught with poison faced not just charges of attempted murder, but accusations of witchcraft, a crime that carried spiritual as well as temporal consequences. The Church, a powerful force in medieval life, condemned poisoners as heretics, their actions a defiance of God's will. This stigma made poisoning a double-edged sword. Its stealth offered a chance at success, but its failure invited accusations that could mobilize entire communities against the assassin. The fear of being labeled a witch or demon forced assassins to be cautious, avoiding any behavior or items that could be misinterpreted as magical dot. The isolation of an assassin's life made poisoning even more daunting. With no allies to assist in acquiring or preparing poison, they had to rely on their own limited knowledge, often gleaned from fleeting encounters with herbalists or folklore passed down in whispers. This lack of support meant that every step gathering ingredients, mixing the poison, delivering it, was a solitary endeavor, with no one to share the burden of failure or fear. The psychological strain of this isolation, combined with the high stakes of poisoning, created a life of relentless tension, where every mission was a test of nerve as much as skill. In the end, the harsh reality of poisoning in medieval Europe was a microcosm of the assassin's precarious existence. It was a method born of desperation, chosen not for its elegance, but for its potential to kill without direct confrontation. Yet its unreliability, combined with the formidable barriers of guarded kitchens, vigilant tasters, and a superstitious society, made it a high-risk strategy with little guarantee of success. Failure brought brutal consequences: interrogation, torture, and execution, while even success offered no reprieve, as the assassin faced the immediate need to escape a stirred-up household and a society quick to see evil in their actions. The use of poison underscored the assassin's place on the margins, their reliance on crude tools, and their constant battle against a world that viewed them as both criminal and supernatural threat. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the broader context of their lives, the betrayals they faced, and the relentless pressures of a trade that was as unforgiving as it was solitary. In the medieval world, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, assassins operated in a shadow realm where their existence was defined by anonymity, their deeds deliberately erased from history to protect the powerful who employed them. Unlike knights, whose valor was celebrated in songs, or nobles, whose legacies were etched into stone and chronicle, assassins were never celebrated, their names obscured or forgotten entirely. Their work killing in secret for coin or favor was a necessary evil in the eyes of their employers, who ensured that no trace of the assassin's identity or involvement remained. This enforced obscurity was both a shield and a curse. It protected the assassin from immediate recognition, allowing them to slip away into the night, but it condemned them to a life and death without recognition, their stories reduced to fleeting whispers in taverns or omitted from the annals of history. The lack of recognition shaped every aspect of an assassin's existence, reinforcing their isolation and underscoring the expendable nature of their role in a society that valued power and prestige. Above all else, the anonymity of assassins was a deliberate construct rooted in the self-preservation of their employers' nobles, clergy, or wealthy merchants who commissioned killings to eliminate rivals or secure their own ambitions. These patrons, often entangled in webs of political intrigue, could not afford to be linked to such heinous acts, as exposure could lead to disgrace, exile, or execution. To protect themselves, they ensured that assassins remained nameless, their involvement buried under layers of secrecy. Contracts were often verbal, struck in darkened alleys or through intermediaries, leaving no written record. Payments, if made, were delivered in unmarked coin or through covert means, such as hidden caches or bribed couriers. If an assassin was caught, their employer would disavow them, claiming ignorance or framing them as a rogue criminal. This erasure was so complete that even successful assassins, who completed their missions and escaped, were rarely acknowledged. Their deeds absorbed into the broader narrative of their employer's triumph. This enforced anonymity served as a shield in some respects, allowing assassins to operate without drawing immediate attention. In a society where reputation and lineage defined one's place, being unknown was a form of protection. A faceless killer could slip through a village or town, blending into the crowd as a laborer, pilgrim, or beggar, their lack of notoriety allowing them to evade suspicion. Unlike a knight, whose heraldry announced their identity, or a merchant, whose wealth marked their status, an assassin's obscurity was their camouflage, enabling them to move unnoticed in a world quick to scrutinize strangers. This anonymity was critical during missions, as it allowed them to infiltrate households, observe targets, or escape without leaving a trail that could be followed. A stolen tunic, a hooded cloak, or a false name could suffice to keep them hidden, their lack of fame a shield against recognition. Yet this same anonymity was a curse, condemning assassins to a life without legacy or acknowledgement. In medieval Europe, where chronicles recorded the deeds of the powerful and ballads celebrated the brave, assassins were excluded from such narratives. Their work, though often pivotal in shaping political or social outcomes, was never glorified. The death of a noble might shift the balance of power, secure a throne, or end a feud, but the assassin who made it happen was erased from the story, their role attributed to divine will, accident, or the machinations of their employer. This erasure extended to their personal lives. Assassins could not boast of their deeds in taverns or share their triumphs with kin, as doing so risked exposure. Their successes, hard-won through cunning and risk, were swallowed by silence, leaving them with no sense of accomplishment or place in the world. The lack of recognition deepened the isolation that defined an assassin's life. Already cut off from friends, family, and community by the nature of their trade, assassins had no one to share their burdens or victories. A knight might return from battle to cheers and feasts, but an assassin, even after a successful kill, faced only the need to flee, their moment of triumph overshadowed by the immediate threat of pursuit or betrayal. This solitude was not just emotional, but existential, as they existed outside the social fabric that gave meaning to others' lives. In a deeply religious age, where legacy and reputation were tied to salvation, the assassin's anonymity was a kind of spiritual death, their actions unrecorded and their souls unmoored from the communal rituals of confession and redemption. Historical records, though sparse, reflect this erasure. Chronicles rarely named assassins, referring to them as a certain man, a vagrant, or a nameless wanderer, to avoid implicating their employers. In 12th century England, a man who killed a bishop was described only as a shadowy figure in a monastic record, his identity obscured to protect the noble who likely hired him. His execution, noted briefly, served as a warning, but his name and story were lost, his role reduced to a footnote in the bishop's martyrdom. Similarly, in 13th century France, a woman who poisoned a merchant was mentioned only as a wretched soul in court documents, her motives and background erased to shield her employer. These fleeting references highlight the deliberate anonymity imposed on assassins, their lives and deaths consigned to obscurity by a system that used them and then discarded them. The societal context of medieval Europe reinforced this lack of recognition. The rigid hierarchy valued the lives of the powerful nobles, clergy, and royalty above all others, with their deeds meticulously recorded in chronicles, charters, or epitaphs. Assassins, drawn from the lowest rungs of society, peasants, fugitives, or outcasts, were seen as expendable tools, their existence barely worth noting. This disparity was evident in the aftermath of a mission, whether successful or not. A noble's death might be mourned with masses and monuments, but the assassin who caused it was either hunted to death or forgotten, their role erased to maintain the illusion of divine order. Even their employers, who benefited from their work, had no incentive to acknowledge them, as doing so risked their own exposure. The psychological toll of this anonymity was profound. Assassins operated in a world where their actions, though impactful, were never acknowledged, leaving them with no sense of purpose or validation. The constant need to remain unseen, to suppress their identity, eroded their sense of self. They could not share their fears, guilt, or triumphs, as doing so invited betrayal or capture. This isolation was compounded by the moral weight of their work. Killing, even for a cause, was a sin in a religious age, and the absence of recognition meant no chance for redemption or forgiveness. The assassin was a ghost, moving through society without leaving a trace, their existence defined by what they could not be known, remembered, or valued. The practical implications of anonymity were equally challenging. To maintain their obscurity, assassins had to avoid anything that might draw attention: flashy clothing, conspicuous spending, or lingering too long in one place. A successful mission might yield a purse of coins, but using it risked exposure, as a peasant with sudden wealth was a magnet for suspicion. Fleeing to a new region was a common tactic, but travel in medieval Europe was fraught with danger. Bandits, tolls, and local authorities made every journey a risk. Adopting a new identity, such as a pilgrim or laborer, required props and backstories that were difficult to maintain without resources or connections. The need to remain anonymous forced assassins to live in a state of perpetual vigilance, always one step ahead of those who might recognize or betray them. The lack of recognition also affected how assassins interacted with their employers. These relationships were purely transactional, marked by mutual distrust. Employers ensured anonymity by using intermediaries or meeting in secret, leaving no record of the transaction. If an assassin demanded recognition or threatened to expose their employer, they risked immediate betrayal, as the powerful had the resources to silence them through violence or false accusations. This dynamic reinforced the assassin's expendability. As their employers saw them as tools to be used and discarded, their contributions erased to protect the true masterminds. The anonymity of assassins extended to their deaths, whether by capture, betrayal, or natural causes. A failed mission often led to execution, with their bodies displayed as warnings, but their names omitted from records. Even a successful career ended in obscurity, as assassins could not retire with fame or wealth without risking exposure. Those who survived long enough to fade away did so as wanderers, their lives unrecorded, their stories lost to time. This lack of legacy was a final indignity, a reminder that their sacrifices enduring fear, isolation, and danger were for nothing in the eyes of the world. In the end, the anonymity and lack of recognition that defined the medieval assassins. Life were both their greatest asset and their heaviest burden. It allowed them to operate in the shadows, slipping through a society that would destroy them if discovered, but it condemned them to a life without meaning or memory. Their deeds, though often pivotal, were erased by those who profited from them, leaving assassins as ghosts in their own stories. The psychological and practical toll of this obscurity shaped every aspect of their existence, from the way they moved through the world to the way they faced their inevitable end. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the tools they used, the betrayals they faced, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as lonely as it was perilous. In the perilous world of medieval assassination, betrayal was not just a risk, but an ever-present shadow that loomed over every mission, transforming even a successful kill into a potential death trap. Employers, whether nobles, clergy, wealthy, merchants, or scheming courtiers, relied on assassins to eliminate their rivals, secure power, or settle vendettas, but their gratitude was fleeting. Eager to erase any evidence that could link them to the crime, these patrons frequently turned on their hired killers, viewing them as dangerous liabilities to be eliminated rather than rewarded. A successful assassination might be followed by an ambush, with the assassin still reeling from the intensity of their task, becoming the next target. In this treacherous landscape, trust was a dangerous illusion, a mirage that could lead to a deadly double cross. Every mission carried the risk of betrayal, forcing assassins to navigate not only the physical dangers of their targets, defenses, but also the duplicity of those who had promised them payment or protection, making their existence a relentless struggle against both external foes and the very hands that fed them. The dynamics of betrayal began with the nature of the employer-assassin relationship, which was inherently transactional and steeped in mutual distrust. In medieval Europe, from roughly the 5th to 15th centuries, those who commissioned assassinations were typically powerful figures, lords vying for land, bishops consolidating ecclesiastical influence, or merchants eliminating trade rivals. These employers operated in a world of political intrigue where a single misstep could lead to ruin, exile, or execution. Hiring an assassin was a calculated risk, as the act of murder, especially of a prominent figure, could spark investigations or vendettas that threatened their status. To mitigate this risk, employers ensured that assassins remained disposable, their identities obscured, and their involvement deniable. Contracts were often struck in secret, through whispered conversations in darkened taverns or via intermediaries who could be silenced if needed. Written agreements were rare, as they left a trail that could be traced, leaving assassins with no proof of their arrangement and no recourse if betrayed. The promise of reward coin, land, or protection was the bait that lured assassins into this dangerous game, but it was rarely honored. For many assassins, drawn from the margins of society, peasants driven by hunger, fugitives fleeing justice, or disgraced soldiers with no prospects, the allure of wealth or a new start was irresistible. A noble might promise a purse of silver to eliminate a rival threatening their claim to a title, while a merchant might offer a share of profits to remove a competitor. Clergy, despite their spiritual authority, were not above such schemes, hiring killers to silence critics or rivals within the church. These promises were intoxicating, but they came with a hidden cost. Once the deed was done, the assassin became a liability, a living witness who could expose their employer's treachery. To protect themselves, employers often chose betrayal, overpayment, turning the assassin into a target to ensure their own safety. The forms of betrayal were as varied as they were ruthless. Some employers simply refused payment, claiming the job was incomplete or too messy. Perhaps the kill was too public, drawing unwanted attention, or the assassin left evidence that sparked suspicion. Others went further, orchestrating ambushes to eliminate the assassin before they could demand their reward. A successful kill might be followed by a meeting in a secluded forest or alley, where the assassin expected payment but found only armed men waiting to silence them. In some cases, employers tipped off local authorities, framing the assassin as a rogue criminal to deflect suspicion from themselves. This double cross was particularly insidious, as it leveraged the assassin's low status, typically a peasant or outcast with no legal standing, ensuring that they would face swift and brutal justice while the employer remained untarnished. Historical records, though sparse, provide chilling examples of such betrayals. In 13th century France, a hired killer named Guillaume was promised a plot of land for assassinating a rival noble. After completing the task, he arrived at the agreed meeting point, only to be ambushed by his employer's guards, narrowly escaping with his life. His story, recorded in a local chronicle, highlights the precarious nature of an assassin's trust in their patron. Another account from 12th century England describes a man hired to kill a bishop, only to be betrayed when his employer alerted the authorities, claiming the assassin acted alone. Captured and executed, the assassin's name was erased from the record, while his employer escaped scrutiny. These tales, though brief, illustrate the grim reality that betrayal was not an exception, but a standard risk of the trade, a constant threat that forced assassins to approach every mission with one eye on their target and another on their employer. The psychological toll of this constant threat of betrayal was immense. Assassins lived in a state of perpetual paranoia, knowing that the person who hired them could become their greatest enemy. This distrust shaped every aspect of their work, from the way they negotiated contracts to the way they planned their escapes. Many demanded partial payment up front, a hedge against betrayal. But even this was no guarantee. Employers could promise more than they intended to deliver, using the initial payment as bait to secure the assassin's commitment. Others used intermediaries to collect payment, hoping to avoid direct contact. But these go-betweens were often as untrustworthy as the employers themselves, susceptible to bribes or coercion. The need to anticipate betrayal added a layer of complexity to an already daunting task, forcing assassins to plan not just for the kill, but for the inevitable double cross that might follow. The practical challenges of avoiding betrayal were formidable. After a successful kill, an assassin had to flee immediately, navigating guarded gates, vigilant patrols, and treacherous terrain, all while knowing that their employer might be setting a trap. A meeting to collect payment could be a lure, with hired thugs waiting in ambush instead of a purse of coins. Escaping to a new region offered some protection, but travel in medieval Europe was slow and dangerous, with bandits, tolls, and local authorities posing constant threats. An assassin carrying coin or goods from a mission risked drawing attention, as sudden wealth in a peasant's hands was a red flag in a society where status was rigid. To avoid betrayal, some assassins insisted on secret drop points for payment hidden, caches in forests or abandoned buildings. But even these could be compromised if the employer anticipated their moves. The societal context of medieval Europe amplified the risk of betrayal. The powerful held all the cards, with resources to manipulate legal systems, bribe officials, or hire mercenaries to eliminate threats. Assassins, by contrast, were typically nobody's peasants, fugitives, or outcasts with no social standing or allies to protect them. If betrayed, they had no recourse. Appealing to authorities was futile, as their low status and criminal actions made them automatic scapegoats. Employers could act with impunity, knowing that a dead or captured assassin posed no threat to their reputation or power. This imbalance made betrayal not just a possibility, but a logical strategy for employers, who saw assassins as disposable tools rather than partners. The fear of betrayal extended beyond the immediate aftermath of a mission, shaping the assassin's entire existence. Each job added to their list of enemies, as employers who betrayed them once might do so again, either to tie up loose ends or to deflect suspicion from future crimes. This meant that even a successful assassin lived in constant flight, unable to trust anyone, their paranoia deepened by the knowledge that their patrons were as dangerous as their targets. The isolation of their trade, already profound, was exacerbated by this lack of trust, leaving them with no one to confide in or rely on. Friends, family, or lovers were liabilities, as employers might target them to pressure or locate the assassin, further cutting them off from any semblance of connection. The moral and spiritual dimensions of betrayal added another layer of torment. In a deeply religious age, where trust and loyalty were seen as virtues, the constant treachery of employers could weigh heavily on an assassin's conscience. Many were driven to their trade by desperation, not malice, and the betrayal of those they served could feel like a personal violation, a reminder of their expendability in a world that valued power over honor. The fear of divine judgment for their sins, murder, deceit, and betrayal loomed large, yet they had no priest or community to offer absolution, their isolation leaving them to wrestle with guilt and fear alone. The long-term consequences of betrayal were as severe as the immediate ones. A betrayed assassin, if they survived the initial double cross, faced a life of heightened danger. Their employer's betrayal might mark them as a wanted criminal, with bounties offered for their capture or death. This notoriety made it harder to find new work as future employers were wary of hiring someone known to have been betrayed, fearing they might seek revenge or exposure. Fleeing to a new region offered temporary respite, but the assassins' past could follow them, as rumors of their deeds spread through trade routes or ecclesiastical networks. Some tried to reinvent themselves, adopting new identities as laborers or pilgrims, but maintaining such a facade required resources and cunning they often lacked in the end. The constant threat of betrayal by their own employers was a defining feature of an assassin's life, a grim reality that underscored their expendability and isolation. Every mission was a gamble, not just against the target's defenses, but against the treachery of those who had hired them. A successful kill offered no safety, only the immediate need to flee from both vengeful allies and duplicitous patrons. Trust was a dangerous illusion, a trap that could lead to ambush, capture, or death. The assassin's existence was a relentless struggle against a world that used them and then discarded them, their deeds erased, their lives defined by the shadow of betrayal. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the tools they used, the disguises they wore, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as treacherous as it was solitary. In the brutal and shadowy world of medieval assassination, the notion of retirement was a cruel fantasy, an unattainable dream for those who lived by the blade or poison. From the 5th to the 15th centuries, assassins, often desperate outcasts, peasants, or fugitives driven to their trade by necessity, faced a life where their past was a relentless pursuer, ensuring that peace and stability remained forever out of reach. Every mission, whether a success or failure, added to a growing list of enemies, vengeful allies of their targets, treacherous employers seeking to erase loose ends, and even younger, hungrier assassins eager to prove themselves by eliminating their predecessors. The weight of these threats forced assassins into a state of constant movement and paranoia, always looking over their shoulder, never able to settle in one place for long. Retirement was not just improbable, but impossible. Survival meant staying one step ahead of death, a relentless race against a past that never forgot and a future that offered no mercy. The life of a medieval assassin was defined by its impermanence. Unlike knights, who might retire to their estates after years of service, or merchants, who could amass wealth and settle into comfortable obscurity, assassins had no such options. Their trade was one of secrecy and violence, each job leaving a trail of enemies who would never forgive or forget. A successful assassination, say, the killing of a noble or bishop, might secure a temporary reward, but it also ignited the wrath of the target's family, retainers, or allies who could offer bounties or dispatch trackers to hunt the assassin across regions. Even a failed attempt marked them as a criminal, with their descriptions circulated among sheriffs, lords, or church officials. This notoriety ensured that an assassin could never rest, as settling in a village or town risked recognition by someone who had heard of their deeds or seen their face in a wanted decree. The threat of betrayal by employers compounded this impossibility of retirement. Those who hired assassins, nobles, clergy, or merchants viewed them as disposable tools, their value ending the moment the job was done. A successful kill often led to betrayal, with employers refusing payment or sending assassins to their deaths to ensure silence. Even if an assassin escaped this immediate treachery, the employer might later betray them to deflect suspicion, naming them to authorities or rival factions. This meant that every mission added not just to the assassins' wealth, if they were lucky enough to be paid, but to their list of pursuers, making any hope of a stable life a distant mirage. A 13th century French chronicle recounts the story of a man who killed a rival lord for a noble employer, only to be hunted by that same employer's men years later when the noble faced accusations of orchestrating the murder. The assassin long since fled to another region, was tracked down and killed, his dream of a quiet life shattered by the long memory of his patron. New assassins posed another threat, as the trade attracted younger, more ambitious individuals eager to make their mark. In a world where reputation was earned through action, an experienced assassin was both a legend and a target. A younger killer might seek to eliminate their predecessor to claim their contracts, prove their prowess, or eliminate competition. This created a cycle of violence where assassins were never safe, even from their own kind. Unlike thieves or bandits, who might form loose alliances, assassins operated alone, their isolation making them vulnerable to these up-and-comers. A 14th century Italian record hints at this dynamic, describing a shadowy killer found dead in a ditch, likely murdered by a rival assassin seeking to take his place in the employ of a powerful merchant. Such stories, though rare, underscore the relentless danger of a trade where even success bred new enemies. The societal structure of medieval Europe made retirement an impossibility. Communities were small and interconnected, with gossip traveling swiftly along trade routes and pilgrimage paths. A stranger settling in a village was a curiosity, their past subject to scrutiny by neighbors or local authorities. For an assassin, whose face or deeds might be known to bounty hunters or vengeful kin, staying in one place was a death sentence. Even adopting a new identity as a laborer, pilgrim, or monk was fraught with risk, as maintaining a disguise required resources, connections, and a knowledge of local customs that most assassins lacked. A single slip in unfamiliar accent, a suspicious coin, or a recognized scar could unravel their cover, drawing the attention of those who sought them. The need for constant movement kept assassins on the fringes, living in forests, abandoned hovels, or transient camps. Their lives a series of fleeting stays in places they could never call home. The psychological toll of this unending flight was profound. Assassins lived in a state of perpetual paranoia, their minds consumed by the fear of discovery. Every stranger was a potential threat, every knock at the door a possible prelude to capture. The weight of their past actions, killings driven by desperation or coercion, added to this burden, as many grappled with guilt or fear of divine judgment in a deeply religious age. The Church taught that murder was a mortal sin, condemning the soul to eternal torment, yet assassins had no access to confession or absolution, their isolation cutting them off from spiritual solace. This spiritual dread, combined with the constant threat of human pursuers, created a life of relentless tension, where moments of peace were as rare as moments of safety. The physical demands of this nomadic existence were equally grueling. Constant movement meant enduring the harsh realities of medieval travel, treacherous roads, bandit-infested forests, and unpredictable weather. Hunger was a frequent companion, as buying food in villages risked drawing attention, and foraging required time and knowledge that assassins, often urban or transient, might not possess. Illness or injury, common in a life of hardship, was a death sentence without access to healers or shelter. A wound from a mission, a fever from a cold night, or a broken bone from a fall could incapacitate an assassin, leaving them vulnerable to capture or death. The lack of allies meant no one to tend their wounds or watch their back, forcing them to rely on their own resilience in a world that offered no mercy. The economic realities of their trade further dashed any hope of retirement. Even if an assassin amassed enough coin to consider settling down, spending it was a challenge. A peasant with sudden wealth drew suspicion in a society where social mobility was rare, and flaunting riches could attract thieves or informants. Hiding wealth was equally difficult. Burying coins risked theft, while carrying them during travel invited robbery. Some assassins tried to barter their earnings for goods or passage to a new region, but these transactions required trust, a commodity they could ill afford. The promise of land, a common lure from employers, was rarely fulfilled, and even when it was, claiming it required legal documentation that a fugitive or outcast could not secure without exposing themselves. Cultural and religious context of medieval Europe added another layer of impossibility to retirement. Society valued lineage, reputation, and communal ties, all of which assassins lacked. A knight might retire to a monastery or manor, their deeds celebrated, but an assassin had no such option. Monasteries, though sanctuaries for some, were unlikely. To accept a stranger with a questionable past, especially one suspected of heinous crimes. The Church, a dominant force, condemned assassins as sinners, their actions a defiance of divine order. This left them with no path to redemption or reintegration, their lives defined by what they could never be. Respected, remembered, or redeemed. The threat of old enemies ensured that an assassin's past was never truly behind them. The death of a noble or cleric created ripples that could last for years, with families or allies seeking vengeance long after the deed was done. Bounties could persist, passed down through generations, as kin sought to restore honor or settle scores. A 12th century English chronicle mentions a man who killed a lord and fled to a distant region, only to be tracked down a decade later by the lord's son, who had sworn to avenge his father. Such stories, though rare, highlight the long memory of vengeance in medieval society, where grudges could outlive the assassin's active career. Even without direct pursuit, the fear of recognition kept assassins on edge, as a chance encounter with a former witness or a bounty hunter could reignite the hunt. The rise of new assassins added a final, chilling dimension to this impossibility of retirement. The trade was a brutal meritocracy, where reputation was earned through action, and an experienced assassin was both a mentor and a target. Younger killers eager to claim contracts or prove their worth might see an older assassin as a rival to be eliminated. This internal threat meant that assassins were never safe, even from their own kind. Unlike other criminals, who might form alliances or retire to a life of relative obscurity, assassins had no such refuge, their skills and reputation a magnet for challengers. This cycle of violence ensured that even those who survived their missions faced a future where death was always near, whether from an enemy's blade or a rival's ambition. In the end, the absence of any chance for retirement was a defining feature of a medieval assassin's life. Their past was a relentless hunter, forcing them into constant movement and paranoia, with no hope of peace or stability. Old enemies, treacherous employers, and new assassins ensured that their lives were a perpetual flight from danger, their deeds erased, their existence defined by isolation and fear. Survival meant staying one step ahead of death, a task that grew harder with every mission, every betrayal, and every year that passed. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve into the tools they used, the disguises they wore, and the relentless pressures of a life spent in the shadows, painting a fuller picture of a trade that was as unforgiving as it was solitary. The life of a medieval assassin, far from the romanticized image of a shadowy mastermind cloaked in mystery, was a brutal, lonely, and unrelentingly miserable existence defined by fear, betrayal, and desperation. From the 5th to the 15th centuries, these individuals, often ordinary people, driven to the margins of society by poverty, circumstance, or coercion, were not the glamorous anti-heroes or cunning villains of modern fiction. They were neither celebrated nor reviled in their time, but rather caught in a cruel system that exploited their desperation, forcing them to kill to survive. Their stories, rarely recorded in the chronicles that immortalized knights and kings, were whispered in the shadows or erased entirely, their lives reduced to fleeting mentions in court records or cautionary tales. As we close this journey into their world, we are left to reflect on the immense weight of their choices, the crushing cost of a life spent in darkness, and the forgotten tragedies of those who dwelt in history's margins. These were not tales of glory, but of survival. Each step a precarious dance with death. Each decision a testament to the human struggle in a world that offered no mercy dot in medieval Europe. Assassins were typically drawn from society's outcast peasants, who had lost their land to greedy lords, soldiers disgraced in battle, or fugitives fleeing justice for crimes born of necessity. These were not trained killers schooled in secret arts, but desperate souls who turned to assassination as a means of survival, lured by promises of coin, land, or redemption. Yet, the reality of their trade was far from the rewards they were promised. Every mission was a gamble, fraught with physical dangers, guarded castles, vigilant servants, and treacherous terrain, and compounded by the constant threat of betrayal from employers who saw them as disposable tools. The act of killing, whether by dagger, poison, or garrote, was only the beginning. Success brought no respite, only the immediate need to flee, while failure meant capture, torture, and a gruesome public execution. Their lives were a relentless cycle of fear, where trust was a fatal weakness and solitude their only constant. Companion, the isolation of an assassin's life was perhaps its most defining feature. Cut off from friends, family, or community, they could form no lasting connections, as any bond risked betrayal or exposure. Even other criminals, thieves, or bandits shunned them, wary of the intense scrutiny their actions invited. This loneliness was not just emotional, but existential, as assassins existed outside the social fabric that gave meaning to medieval life. In a world where identity was tied to village, guild, or lord, they were rootless, drifting through towns and forests as ghosts, their presence unnoticed or unwelcome. The psychological toll of this isolation was immense, as they faced their fears, guilt, and paranoia alone, with no one to share the burden of their choices. The act of killing, especially in a religious age where murder was a mortal sin, weighed heavily on their consciences, yet they had no access to confession or absolution, their spiritual isolation mirroring their physical solitude. Betrayal was a constant shadow lurking in every transaction. Employers, nobles, clergy, or merchants used assassins to eliminate rivals or settle scores, but rarely honored their promises. A successful kill often led to a double cross, with employers refusing payment or sending men to silence the assassin, ensuring no witness could link them to the crime. This treachery forced assassins to approach every mission with one eye on their target and another on their patron. Their paranoia deepened by the knowledge that those who hired them were as dangerous as those they were hired to kill. Historical accounts, though sparse, offer glimpses of this grim reality. In 13th century France, a man named Guillaume, hired to kill a rival noble, was ambushed by his employer's guards after delivering proof of the deed. His escape a rare stroke of luck in a trade where such fortune was scarce. These betrayals were not exceptions, but the norm, a reminder that assassins were expendable pawns in a game played by the powerful. The physical demands of their trade were relentless. Assassins navigated a world of fortified castles with moats and high walls, guarded by battle-hardened veterans and vigilant servants. Their tools, crude daggers, frayed ropes, or unreliable poisons were scavenged or stolen, reflecting their desperation and lack of resources. Every mission required meticulous planning, from reconnaissance to escape routes, yet no plan could account for the unpredictability of human behavior or the whims of chance. A creaking floorboard, a barking dog, or a sudden rain could unravel their efforts, turning a stealthy approach into a desperate flight. The constant movement required to avoid detection, fleeing from one region to another, hiding in forests or hovels, took a toll on their bodies, with hunger, cold, and injury constant threats. An assassin's life was one of endurance. Their survival depended on their ability to push through exhaustion and fear. Superstition, added another layer of peril. Medieval society, steeped in religious fervor, saw assassins as agents of dark forces, their secretive killings interpreted as the work of witches or demons. A suspicious death could spark mob hysteria, with villagers hunting for the cursed killer, driven by fear of divine retribution. This perception turned even a minor mistake, a dropped weapon or a fleeting glimpse, into a catalyst for a witch hunt, where accusations of sorcery were as deadly as charges of murder. The Church, a dominant force, condemned assassins as heretics, their actions a defiance of God's order, further isolating them from any hope of redemption. This climate of fear forced assassins to avoid anything that could be seen as supernatural, such as carrying unusual herbs or moving at night. Yet their very trade invited such suspicions, making every mission a battle against both human and imagined threats. The lack of recognition was a final indignity. Unlike knights, whose deeds were celebrated in song, or nobles, whose legacies were preserved in chronicles, assassins were erased from history. Their employers ensured their anonymity, burying their involvement to protect themselves. A successful kill might shift the balance of power, but the assassin's role was never acknowledged, their name omitted from records or reduced to a certain man or a nameless wanderer. This erasure was both a shield, protecting them from immediate pursuit, and a curse, condemning them to obscurity. They could not boast of their deeds or seek validation, as doing so risked exposure. Their lives, filled with risk and sacrifice, left no mark on the world, their stories lost to time or whispered only as cautionary tales. Retirement was an impossible dream. The past followed assassins relentlessly, with enemies, both the allies of their targets and their own employers never forgetting. A successful mission created new foes, while a failed one marked them as wanted criminals. Even if they amassed enough coin to consider settling down, spending it drew suspicion in a society where wealth was tied to status. Fleeing to a new region offered temporary respite, but the long memory of vengeance meant that bounties or grudges could resurface years later. Younger assassins, eager to prove themselves, might target their predecessors, seeing them as rivals, or stepping stones to reputation. This cycle of violence and pursuit ensured that an assassin's life was a perpetual flight, with no hope of a peaceful end. The moral and spiritual weight of their choices was a constant burden. Many assassins were not hardened killers, but ordinary people pushed into their trade by desperation, starvation, loss, or coercion. The act of killing, even if justified by survival, clashed with the religious teachings of the time, where murder was a sin that could damn the soul. Yet their isolation meant no access to priests or community, leaving them to grapple with guilt and fear of divine judgment alone. This spiritual isolation, combined with the physical and psychological toll of their trade, created a life of unrelenting misery, where every day was a struggle to survive in a world that offered no forgiveness. As we reflect on the lives of these forgotten figures, we see not heroes or villains, but human beings caught in a cruel system that exploited their desperation. Their stories, though rarely recorded, are a testament to the resilience and tragedy of those who lived in history's shadows. They were not masters of their fate, but pawns in a game played by the powerful, their choices shaped by necessity and their lives defined by sacrifice. The weight of their decisions to kill, to flee, to endure, reminds us of the human cost of survival in a world without mercy. Their fleeting existence, erased from the chronicles, fills the margins of history with tales of struggle, betrayal, and quiet endurance. As we close this journey, let us pause to consider the lives of these forgotten souls, whose dreams were as perilous as the darkness they inhabited. Thank you for joining me in this exploration. Sleep well, and may your dreams be less burdened than theirs.